There is a recording that, according to multiple independent sources, once existed in the archives of the Soviet space program. It captured the voice of a cosmonaut transmitting from somewhere in the vicinity of the moon, describing something that the official record does not mention. The recording was classified within hours, then it was reclassified. Then, according to those who claim to have heard fragments of it, it was erased entirely. What follows is the story of that recording, the cosmonaut who made it, the program that buried it, and the questions about the moon that have not been answered in any official capacity by any space agency in over half a century. If the kind of mystery that sits quietly between fact and silence is the kind that draws you in, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It genuinely helps more than you know. Now, let's begin. The Cold War space race is remembered today as a competition between two superpowers to plant a flag on the lunar surface. The Americans got there first in July 1969. The Soviets, it is widely said, never quite made it. The story is clean, the story is incomplete. The actual history of what each side was doing in those years, what each side was finding, and what each side chose not to share with its own population, let alone with the other side, is far stranger than the textbook version suggests. In the West, the space program operated under significant public scrutiny. NASA conducted its missions live on television. Astronauts gave press conferences, mission control rooms were filmed. The scientific data was published in peer-reviewed journals. Failures, when they occurred, became national news within hours. The Apollo on fire, the Apollo 13 oxygen tank rupture, the Challenger disaster decades later. The American program was not transparent in the sense of revealing everything, but it was public in a way that the Soviet program never was. The Soviet program operated under a different logic entirely. It was a military-industrial undertaking conducted under conditions of absolute state secrecy. Cosmonauts were trained at facilities that did not officially exist. Their selection was classified. Their missions were announced only after successful return, and frequently not until significant time had passed. Failures were not announced at all. Cosmonauts who died in training accidents simply disappeared from the historical record, their families silenced, their photographs retouched. The N-1 rocket, the Soviet equivalent of the Saturn V, intended to carry cosmonauts to the moon, exploded on the launch pad 4 times between 1969 and 1972. None of those failures was publicly acknowledged by the Soviet government until decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union itself in 1991. The cultural difference between the two programs went deeper than their respective approaches to publicity. The American program operated within a framework that, however imperfectly, recognized the public's right to know what was being done with public funds. The Soviet program operated within a framework that recognized no such right. Information about the program was the property of the state, to be disclosed or withheld according to the state's calculation of what would best serve its interests. Cosmonauts, engineers, and program officials understood this framework intuitively. They had grown up within it. They did not require explicit instruction to understand which categories of information could be shared with whom and under what circumstances. The discipline was internalized rather than imposed, which made it both more effective and more difficult to circumvent through ordinary channels of inquiry. What this means, for the question of what the Soviet program actually accomplished and what it actually discovered, is that the public record is necessarily incomplete. The documents that have been declassified since 1991 reveal a program far more ambitious, far more extensive, and far more secretive than the version that was visible to Western observers during the Cold War years. Manned lunar missions were planned. Reconnaissance of the lunar surface was conducted. Specific cosmonauts were trained for lunar landings that never officially happened. And the communications between cosmonauts in flight and ground control were recorded, transcribed, and, in certain cases, restricted in ways that have never been fully explained. The story of what one cosmonaut may or may not have witnessed during a mission, whose full details remain partially classified, is, in this context, not implausible by default. The Soviet space program had both the operational scope and the institutional secrecy to support exactly the kind of buried record that the title of this video suggests. Whether such a recording existed, whether it was indeed erased, and whether what it captured was what some accounts suggest, these are questions that cannot be definitively answered from publicly available documents. But the absence of definitive proof is not, in this case, the same as the absence of any reason to ask the question. The space race was not just a competition. It was a sustained, decades-long encounter with the unknown by two superpowers that did not trust each other and did not always trust their own populations. What was found during that encounter, by both sides in various forms, has not been fully revealed even now, more than half a century after the most intense period of the race concluded. The story that follows is built from declassified documents, retired cosmonauts' memoirs, retired NASA engineers' accounts, the work of independent researchers who have spent decades reconstructing the partial public record, and the persistent unanswered questions that none of the official narratives quite resolve. It is a story whose final chapters have not yet been written, because the relevant agencies have not yet released, and may never release, the materials that would write them. The full extent of what the Soviet space program concealed from the public, and continues to conceal in some cases, has emerged slowly over the decades since the collapse of the USSR. Each release of archival material has revised the picture of what was actually happening at Baikonur, at Star City, and in the various secret design bureaus where the program was managed. The pattern that emerges is consistent. The program was systematically larger than its public presentation suggested. Its failures were systematically hidden. Its successes were sometimes hidden as well, when the timing of their announcement did not serve political objectives. And the rules governing what could be discussed by participants, even after their official retirement from service, were extraordinarily strict and were enforced for decades. The most famous of the concealed programs was the N-1 lunar rocket. Between 1969 and 1972, the Soviet Union attempted to launch 4 N-1 rockets, each intended to test the systems that would eventually carry cosmonauts to the moon. All 4 launches ended in failure, in some cases catastrophic. The second N-1 launch in July 1969, just weeks before Apollo 11 reached the moon, produced one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in the history of rocketry. The rocket fell back onto its launch pad and detonated with such force that the launch complex was destroyed and debris was found over a radius of several kilometers. This event was not acknowledged by the Soviet government for over 20 years. As far as the Soviet public was concerned, in 1969 the Soviet Union had simply chosen not to compete in the lunar race. The truth was something else entirely. The cosmonaut training program for lunar missions was similarly hidden. Specific cosmonauts, including Alexei Leonov, who had performed the first human spacewalk in 1965, had been selected and trained for a manned circumlunar mission and, eventually, a manned lunar landing. Leonov spoke openly about this training in his memoirs published after the fall of the Soviet Union. But during the Cold War, the existence of these specific assignments was known only to those directly involved. Cosmonauts had been chosen for missions they would never fly because the missions themselves were ultimately cancelled. But the cancellation was not announced. The cosmonauts simply remained in the active roster, training for missions that the Soviet government had decided to abandon without acknowledging that any such missions had ever been planned. The pattern of concealment extended beyond the rocket program and the cosmonaut selection process. The handling of cosmonaut deaths during training and during flight followed similar rules. Valentin Bondarenko, a 24-year-old cosmonaut trainee, died in 1961 during an isolation chamber test when a small fire in the pure oxygen environment killed him. The accident was not publicly acknowledged for 25 years. Bondarenko's name was systematically removed from group photographs of the cosmonaut corps, his existence erased from the official record of the program until Glasnost-era reforms finally permitted the truth to emerge. Vladimir Komarov died in 1967 when the parachute system of his Soyuz 1 capsule failed during re-entry. His death was acknowledged because it was too public to hide, but the circumstances surrounding the mission, the rushed timeline, the known defects in the spacecraft, the political pressure to launch despite engineering objections were not revealed until decades later. The cultural mechanism that produced this concealment was not simply propaganda in the conventional sense. It was a structural feature of how the Soviet state organized information about its own activities. Cosmonauts, engineers, and program managers operated under signed agreements that bound them to secrecy for decades, in some cases, for life. The agreements were enforced not only by the threat of imprisonment, but by the more subtle threat of professional and social exclusion. Speaking openly about classified aspects of the program meant the end of one's career, the loss of one's apartment, the removal of one's children from desirable schools, the systematic dismantling of one's life. The mechanism produced silence not through dramatic intervention, but through the quiet certainty that talking was simply not survivable as a professional and personal strategy. What this means for the question of buried records is significant. If a cosmonaut had witnessed something during a flight that the program directors did not want known, the mechanisms for ensuring that the witnessing did not enter the public record were already in place, already practiced, already proven effective across thousands of cases involving information far less sensitive than anomalous observations from the lunar vicinity. The infrastructure of silence was robust, and it operated even in cases where there was no particular reason to suppress the information, simply because suppression had become institutional habit. The default disposition for any unusual mission event was restriction, not release. The default required no decision. Release, on the other hand, required an active decision by someone with the authority to make it, and such decisions were uncommon during the period in question. The constraints placed on Soviet cosmonauts regarding what they could discuss publicly were so stringent that for decades the cosmonaut corps functioned essentially as a closed society, a community whose members shared experiences that they could not share with anyone outside the community, including their own families. The constraints were formalized in non-disclosure agreements that ran to dozens of pages and covered not only specific operational details, but also general impressions, personal reactions, and any observation that had not been pre-approved for public discussion. Cosmonauts who returned from missions were debriefed extensively by both technical and political officers, and the debriefings produced multiple categories of documentation: the technical report, the medical report, the psychological report, the political report, and in some cases an additional category of report whose existence was acknowledged only obliquely in declassified documents released after 1991. The technical and medical reports have become reasonably accessible in the post-Soviet era. The psychological reports remain partially classified. The political reports remain almost entirely classified, available only to researchers with specific archival access, and even then, often with significant redactions. The additional category of report, which appears in some declassified inventories under labels such as extraordinary observations or anomalous events, has not been released in any form for any mission. Its existence is documented in the inventories of report types, but the contents of any specific report in this category have never been made public. This may mean that no such reports were ever filed, in which case the category exists only as a bureaucratic placeholder. Or it may mean that the reports were filed, exist somewhere in the archives, and have simply not been declassified. From outside the archives, the difference between these possibilities cannot be determined. The cosmonauts who flew during the most intensive period of the lunar race, roughly 1968 through 1976, were aware of these constraints throughout their careers. Alexei Leonov, in interviews and memoirs published after the fall of the Soviet Union, described the mental discipline required to discuss missions in ways that did not violate the agreements while still communicating something meaningful about the experiences. He spoke of mission elements that could be discussed and mission elements that could not. He referred occasionally to colleagues who had experienced things during flight that they had not been permitted to discuss even with each other after returning. He did not specify what those things were. He did not name the colleagues directly. The references appear in his memoirs as oblique notes, easily overlooked in the larger narrative of his career, but consistent across multiple texts written at different times. Pavel Belyaev, who commanded the Voskhod 2 mission during which Leonov made the first spacewalk in 1965, reportedly experienced unexplained communication anomalies during the flight that were briefly mentioned in the technical debriefing, but were not subsequently discussed in any public account. Belyaev died in 1970, before Glasnost made discussion of such matters possible. His widow, in interviews given in the 1990s, mentioned that her husband had occasionally hinted at having seen things during his missions that he could not describe, but she did not provide specifics, and Belyaev himself left no detailed written account. German Titov, the second human to orbit the Earth, flying on Vostok 2 in August 1961, gave interviews in the 1990s in which he described unusual sensations and visual impressions during his mission that he had not been allowed to discuss in his original debriefings. Titov framed these descriptions cautiously, noting that some of his impressions might have been products of disorientation, fatigue, or the psychological effects of spaceflight. But he was clear that, whatever the explanation, the original mission reports had not contained mention of these experiences, and the omission had been by directive rather than by oversight. What this pattern reveals is not that something specific was being hidden, necessarily, but that the institutional capacity for hiding existed and was used routinely. Cosmonauts were trained in effect to be unreliable narrators of their own experiences when those experiences fell outside approved parameters. The training was so thorough and so deeply embedded in the operational culture that the cosmonauts themselves often had difficulty separating, in retrospect, what they had actually witnessed from what they had been permitted to acknowledge witnessing. This produced a generation of veterans of the most ambitious exploration program in human history who could not be relied upon to fully describe what they had done, not because they were dishonest, but because they had been trained over years to be carefully selective about which truths could be allowed into the public record. The selection was not theirs to make. It was made for them and then enforced by their own internal discipline as long as they remained in the program. Before any human had set foot on the moon, the Soviet Union had already accomplished a remarkable series of lunar firsts using robotic spacecraft. The lunar program, which ran from 1958 to 1976, represented the most sustained robotic exploration of the moon ever conducted, and many of its accomplishments preceded the comparable American achievements by years. Luna 1, launched in January 1959, became the first human-made object to escape Earth's gravity and reach the vicinity of the moon, although it missed its intended impact target and instead became the first artificial object to enter solar orbit, where it remains today. Luna 2 in September 1959 became the first human-made object to reach the lunar surface, impacting near the Mare Imbrium and depositing 2 metallic pennants engraved with the Soviet coat of arms. Luna 3, in October 1959, achieved something that would not be matched for another 6 years. It photographed the far side of the moon for the first time in human history. The photographs returned by Luna 3 were grainy, distorted, and partially incomprehensible. The spacecraft had used a primitive onboard photographic process that exposed film, developed it inside the probe, scanned it electronically, and transmitted the data back to Earth. But despite their technical limitations, the images showed something that no human eye had ever seen. The hemisphere of the moon permanently turned away from Earth. The far side was visibly different from the near side. It contained fewer of the dark planes called Maria, which dominate the near side and create the familiar pattern that human observers had been seeing for the entire history of civilization. Instead, the far side was almost entirely heavily cratered highland terrain. The asymmetry was unexpected and remains, to this day, not fully explained by lunar science. The lunar program continued with increasing sophistication throughout the 1960s. Luna 9, in February 1966, achieved the first soft landing on the moon, returning photographs from the lunar surface that demonstrated, contrary to some pre-mission concerns, that the lunar dust was firm enough to support landed equipment. Luna 10, 2 months later, became the first spacecraft to enter orbit around the moon. Luna 16, in September 1970, became the first robotic mission to return lunar samples to Earth, beating the American Surveyor program's similar capability. The Lunokhod rovers, Lunokhod 1 in 1970 and Lunokhod 2 in 1973, became the first robotic vehicles to operate on the surface of another world, covering a combined distance of more than 45 kilometers and returning thousands of photographs and detailed surface measurements. What these missions had accomplished, beyond their headline achievements, was a comprehensive reconnaissance of the lunar surface from orbit and from selected landing sites. The data collected included high-resolution imagery, gravitational field measurements, magnetic field measurements, radiation environment characterization, sample composition analysis, and detailed mapping of specific regions that had been selected as candidates for eventual human landings. Some of this data was released publicly through scientific publications. Some of it was retained in classified Soviet archives. Some of it has been released in the post-Soviet era. Some of it, according to surviving program participants, remains classified to this day, though the rationale for continued classification more than 5 decades after the missions concluded has never been officially explained. The lunar missions also produce something that the standard accounts of the program do not emphasize, but that becomes visible in the detailed mission records, a series of anomalous observations that were noted in the technical telemetry but not publicly discussed. Specific instances include unexplained signal modulations recorded by Luna 10 during its time in lunar orbit, gravitational measurements from Luna 14 that did not match the theoretical predictions, and a brief electrical anomaly experienced by Lunokhod 2 during its second day of surface operations that was attributed at the time to a malfunction, but was never satisfactorily explained even after detailed engineering review. None of these anomalies, individually was sufficient to indicate any specific phenomenon worth public discussion. Collectively, they suggested that the lunar environment contained features and behaviors that the program's theoretical models had not anticipated. The program officially ended with Luna 24 in 1976, which returned 170 grams of lunar soil to Earth. After Luna 24, the Soviet Union conducted no further lunar missions for the remainder of its existence, despite the program's evident success and the relatively modest cost of additional missions. The decision to end the lunar program has been attributed to various factors: budget constraints, the redirection of resources to other priorities, the political view that further lunar work would not add to Soviet prestige. None of these explanations has ever been fully documented from internal program records, which means none of them can be definitively confirmed as the actual reason the program stopped when it did. The data returned by the early lunar missions was processed by specialized teams at the Vernadsky Institute of Geochemistry and Analytical Chemistry in Moscow and at the Space Research Institute of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The processing was slow by modern standards because the computers available in the 1960s were limited, and the data streams from the probes were enormous relative to the processing capacity. Some of the data was analyzed in detail during the mission timeframes. Other data was set aside for later analysis when computing resources permitted. Still other data was analyzed but not released, for reasons that varied across missions and that were not always documented even in internal records. The Luna 3 farside photographs presented immediate puzzles to Soviet lunar scientists. The visible asymmetry between the near and far sides, the relative absence of Maria on the far side, required explanation. The standard theoretical framework of lunar geology in the early 1960s did not provide one. Various hypotheses were proposed, including the idea that the gravitational pull of Earth had concentrated the formation of Maria on the near side, or the idea that the Moon's crust was thicker on the far side and therefore less penetrable by the magmatic processes that produced the Maria, and the idea that the asymmetry reflected an ancient impact event that had altered the lunar interior in ways that affected subsequent geological evolution. None of these hypotheses was fully developed in the early 1960s, and the question of why the far side looks fundamentally different from the near side remains an active area of lunar science. The Luna 9 and Luna 13 surface images, returned from successful soft landings in 1966 and 1967 respectively, provided the first close-up views of the lunar surface ever obtained. The images showed a landscape that was, in most respects, exactly what had been expected: a dusty, cratered surface scattered with rocks of various sizes, illuminated by sharp sunlight casting long shadows. But in specific images from both missions, features appeared that drew the attention of analysts and that have remained subjects of discussion since. Luna 9 returned images that showed objects on the surface near the landing site that some analysts interpreted as elongated structures of unusual geometry, features that did not obviously match the expected appearance of natural rocks. The official interpretation was that these were simply rocks, viewed at unusual angles, that happened to produce striking shadows. This interpretation was eventually accepted as the consensus view, but the initial analysis, conducted by a small team at the Vernadsky Institute, had produced a preliminary report suggesting that the features warranted further examination. The preliminary report was not released and has not been seen by any researcher since its original circulation among program officials. Luna Cod 1, during its operation on the lunar surface from November 1970 to September 1971, returned over 20,000 photographs and conducted hundreds of soil mechanics tests. The rover operated for nearly 11 Earth months, far exceeding its planned 3-month mission lifetime, and traversed approximately 10.5 kilometers of lunar surface in the Mare Imbrium region. The scientific results from Lunokhod 1 were published extensively in Soviet scientific journals and were the basis for numerous subsequent papers on lunar geology, but a small subset of the photographs from Lunokhod 1 was never published. These were not photographs of obvious technical failures or operational problems. They were photographs of the lunar surface that, for reasons that were not documented in the publicly available program records, were classified as not suitable for public release. Whether this was because of specific anomalous features in the images, or because of routine administrative decisions about which photographs to highlight versus archive, has never been clarified. Some of these unpublished photographs have appeared in recent years on Russian websites devoted to Soviet space history, leaked from various sources. The contents are unremarkable to the casual eye, but specific images show features that some independent analysts have interpreted as unusual. Lunokhod 2, operating in the Le Monnier crater region from January through May 1973, traversed approximately 39 kilometers of lunar surface, a record that stood until the Mars rover Opportunity finally exceeded it in 2014. The rover encountered an environment somewhat different from Lunokhod 1's traverse area, with steeper slopes, more rocks, and more complex terrain features. The mission ended when the rover's lid, which had been left open to allow the radiators to function during the lunar day, accidentally contacted a crater wall during a navigation maneuver and could not be closed properly. Dust contamination then prevented the rover from radiating heat during subsequent lunar nights, and electronics failed. This is the official version of the mission's end. Whether there are alternative versions in classified documents is not currently known. The Soviet manned lunar program was officially designated by a series of project numbers that obscured rather than revealed its purpose. The most ambitious component, designated L3, was intended to land cosmonauts on the lunar surface using the N1 rocket as a launch vehicle and a modified Soyuz spacecraft, called the LK lander, as the actual landing vehicle. A separate program designated L1 or Zond was intended to send cosmonauts on a circumlunar trajectory, a free return loop around the Moon that did not require landing, using a different launch vehicle, the Proton rocket. Both programs operated in parallel through the late 1960s, and both were considered to have a realistic chance of preceding the American Apollo program to their respective milestones. Neither succeeded in its full objectives. Both produced trained cosmonaut crews who waited for missions that never flew. The selection process for these lunar-class cosmonaut assignments was conducted with even greater secrecy than the general cosmonaut selection process. The criteria included not only the standard physical and psychological requirements that applied to all cosmonauts, but additional requirements related to political reliability, professional discretion, and demonstrated ability to handle classified information without unauthorized disclosure. The cosmonauts selected for lunar missions were among the most experienced and most trusted in the Soviet program. They were by background and training individuals who had already proven their willingness and ability to operate within the strict information boundaries that the program required. Alexei Leonov, who would have been the first Soviet cosmonaut to walk on the Moon if the L3 program had succeeded, was an experienced cosmonaut by the time he was assigned to the lunar program. He had performed the first human spacewalk in 1965 during the Voskhod 2 mission and had handled and weathered an emergency during that spacewalk. His suit had inflated more than expected in the vacuum, preventing him from re-entering the airlock without taking the dangerous step of partially depressurizing the suit, with the kind of calm competence that the program valued highly. His selection for the lunar mission was, in operational terms, an obvious choice. His training for the mission proceeded for several years, including extensive simulations of lunar landing operations, surface operations in spacesuit, and rendezvous and docking maneuvers in lunar orbit. Oleg Makarov was selected for the circumlunar program and conducted extensive training for a Zond mission that would have carried him around the Moon in a free return trajectory. The Zond program achieved several unmanned successes that demonstrated the feasibility of the manned configuration. Zond 5 carried turtles, plants, and bacteria around the Moon and returned them to Earth in September 1968, and subsequent Zond missions further developed the systems, but the manned variant was repeatedly delayed and ultimately cancelled in 1970 after Apollo 8 successfully demonstrated the American capability and the political rationale for a Soviet circumlunar mission diminished. Makarov flew several other missions during his career, including Soyuz 12 and Soyuz 18, but never travelled to the Moon. Pavel Belyaev was originally selected for a lunar mission, but was diagnosed with stomach cancer during his training and was removed from the active flight roster. He died in 1970, before the program's eventual cancellation. The specific details of his lunar assignment have never been fully disclosed. Records indicate that he was being trained as a commander for a mission whose precise objectives are not specified in the declassified materials available to date. The redactions in his training file are notable for their pattern. Specific dates and mission references are blacked out while surrounding contextual material is preserved, suggesting that the relevant authorities considered some elements of his preparation sensitive enough to warrant continued restriction, even after most other aspects of the program had been declassified. Other cosmonauts trained for lunar missions whose names appear in declassified rosters, but whose specific assignments remain partially redacted, include Valery Bukovsky, who had flown the Vostok 5 mission in 1963, Pyotr Klimuk, who later commanded several space station missions, and Vitaly Sevastyanov, who flew on Soyuz 9 and Soyuz 18. Each of these cosmonauts received specific training for lunar-class operations that exceeded what would have been required for their actual eventual missions, suggesting that their assignments had been more ambitious than what was ultimately accomplished. The training records, where available, document extensive preparation for tasks that the cosmonauts in question would never publicly perform, tasks that, in some cases, neither the cosmonauts nor their superiors would acknowledge having prepared for, decades after the relevant missions had been cancelled. The pattern that emerges from the partial records of the Soviet lunar cosmonaut roster is one of substantial preparation for missions that were ultimately not flown. Years of training, specific assignments, detailed mission planning, all of which produced cosmonauts who knew, in considerable detail, what their lunar missions would have involved had they been permitted to proceed. Some of these cosmonauts have since spoken about their preparation in retirement, others have died without speaking publicly about their assignments. The full content of their training and the specific objectives they had been assigned to accomplish remains incompletely documented in the materials currently available outside these still classified Soviet space program archives. The training facility known as Star City, Zvyozhny Gorodok in Russian, was located approximately 30 kilometers northeast of Moscow, in a forested area that had been chosen specifically for its isolation from population centers. The facility had been built in the late 1950s and expanded continuously through the 1960s and 1970s as the Soviet space program grew in scope and ambition. By the late 1960s, Star City housed several thousand personnel, including cosmonauts and their families, trainers, engineers, doctors, and support staff. The facility was not marked on Soviet maps. Its existence was officially classified until the late 1980s. Travel to and from the facility required specific authorization. The cosmonauts who lived and trained there operated under a regime of supervision that extended into nearly every aspect of their personal lives. The training for lunar missions at Star City involved several specialized facilities that were constructed specifically to simulate the conditions cosmonauts would face during such missions. A large rotating arm allowed cosmonauts to experience sustained acceleration up to 20 times the force of gravity, simulating the loads they would encounter during launch and re-entry. A water immersion facility, a large pool in which cosmonauts could perform mock spacewalks in pressurized suits, allowed practice of extravehicular activities in conditions that approximated weightlessness. A lunar surface simulator, located in an outdoor area of the facility, recreated the appearance and physical characteristics of the lunar terrain using carefully prepared soil and lighting that mimicked the harsh shadows of the lunar environment. The lunar surface simulator was constructed to replicate as accurately as possible the specific landing sites that had been selected for Soviet missions. The soil composition was chosen based on the analysis of samples that had been returned by the lunar sample return missions. The topography was modelled on imagery from the Lunokhod rovers and from Soviet lunar orbital reconnaissance. Cosmonauts trained on this simulator wearing prototype lunar suits, the Krechet suit, designed specifically for the LK Lander program, and conducted simulated mission timelines that included specific tasks at specific locations. The training was sufficiently detailed that cosmonauts could perform their mission objectives without explicit reference to mission plans during simulated runs, simply by following the procedures they had memorized through repetition. What is interesting about the training procedures, beyond their thoroughness, is what they included beyond the standard mission objectives. Declassified training schedules from the period 1968 through 1971 include time allocated to procedures with vague designations that do not match any of the specific mission tasks that were officially planned. Categories such as anomaly response protocols, surface contingency operations, and extended communication procedures appear in the schedules without detailed elaboration. These categories required dozens of hours of training time, suggesting that they involved substantive operational content. But the specific content of the training that occupied these hours is not documented in the materials that have been released. Whether this represents training for contingencies that the program planners considered possible but unlikely, or training for specific scenarios that the program planners had reason to expect, is not clear from the available records. The psychological preparation of cosmonauts for lunar missions included specific elements that distinguished it from the psychological preparation for orbital missions. Cosmonauts assigned to lunar missions underwent extended sessions with a small team of specialized psychologists whose backgrounds included not only standard space program psychological training, but also experience with classified military psychological operations. The sessions reportedly included a discussion of how to handle unexpected observations during flight, how to maintain operational discipline under conditions of significant stress, and how to manage communication with ground control in scenarios where standard protocols might not apply. The content of these sessions has not been released in declassified materials. Some cosmonauts have referred to them obliquely in memoirs as preparation for things that the program acknowledged might be encountered but did not specifically anticipate. The simulation procedures included emergency scenarios that ranged from standard spacecraft system failures to more unusual contingencies. Among the unusual contingencies, declassified materials mention specifically the procedure designated for what was called in the Soviet operational vocabulary an extraordinary observation, a category that was never publicly defined but that appears repeatedly in training documentation. Cosmonauts were instructed in how to handle communications with ground control if they were to encounter such an extraordinary observation, what level of detail to provide, what records to preserve, and what procedures to follow upon return to Earth. The specific content of these procedures remains classified, even in the post-Soviet era. The fact that such procedures existed at all, and that significant training time was devoted to them, is itself a notable feature of the historical record. A record that suggests the program took seriously the possibility that its cosmonauts might encounter something that fell outside the standard mission expectations. The Zond program, designed to send cosmonauts on a free return trajectory around the Moon, achieved a series of unmanned successes that demonstrated the feasibility of the manned configuration without ever culminating in an actual manned flight. Zond 5, launched in September 1968, carried a payload of biological specimens, 2 Russian tortoises, wine flies, mealworms, plants and bacteria, on a journey around the Moon and back to Earth, becoming the first spacecraft to return living creatures from the lunar vicinity. Zond 6, in November 1968, repeated the achievement but suffered a partial re-entry failure that damaged the recovered capsule. Zond 7, in August 1969, completed a successful circumlunar mission and returned high-quality colour photographs of the Moon and Earth. Zond 8, in October 1970, was the final Zond mission, completing another successful circumlunar flight before the program was terminated. What made the Zond missions of particular interest beyond their direct objectives was the radio communications they conducted during their flights, and specifically what was recorded by sources outside the Soviet space program who were listening on the relevant frequencies. The Soviet Union, like the United States, conducted its space program radio communications on frequencies that could in principle be monitored by anyone with appropriate equipment. While the actual content of the communications was often in encoded form, the existence of communications and the basic timing patterns were observable to anyone with a sufficiently sensitive radio receiver and a clear line of sight to the relevant communication windows. The most famous of the independent monitors during this period were the Giudica Cordiglia brothers, 2 Italian radio enthusiasts who operated a sophisticated radio interception facility from a converted World War II bunker near Turin from approximately 1957 through the mid-1970s. The brothers, Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia, built and operated equipment that exceeded the radio reception capabilities of most national space programs of the era. They tracked nearly every Soviet space mission of the period, recording communications, calculating orbital parameters from Doppler shifts in the received signals, and in some cases publishing their findings before the Soviet Union officially announced the missions. The brothers' archive included recordings that they claimed were from Soviet space missions that had ended in failure, but had not been publicly acknowledged. The most famous of these, the Lost Cosmonauts recordings, purported to capture the voices of cosmonauts who had died during flights that the Soviet Union had never officially announced. The authenticity of these recordings has been debated for decades. Skeptics have noted technical inconsistencies between the recordings and the operational characteristics of actual Soviet missions of the period, suggesting that some or all of the recordings may have been fabrications or misidentifications. Supporters of the recording's authenticity have argued that the technical inconsistencies are themselves products of the unusual conditions under which the Soviet program operated, including the use of unfamiliar equipment and procedures during emergencies that the program never planned for. For the question of Zond program communications, What is relevant is that the brothers and other independent monitors were listening during the period of the Zond flights, and recordings from this period exist in private and institutional archives that have never been fully analysed in public. Most of what was captured during the Zond missions was routine: telemetry signals, basic mission control communications, status updates from the unmanned spacecraft. But specific intervals during specific Zond missions produced communications patterns that did not match the expected profile of an unmanned mission. Voice transmissions appeared in recordings from intervals during which, according to the official mission profile, no voice communication should have been occurring. The recordings are of poor quality, the words mostly indistinguishable, and the language Russian, making detailed analysis difficult for non-Russian speaking analysts. The official Soviet position on these recordings, when the matter was occasionally raised in subsequent decades, was straightforward. The recordings either captured normal program communications that did not include cosmonauts, or they were not from Zond missions at all, but from other Soviet space activities being conducted simultaneously, or they were fabrications by Western intelligence agencies. Each of these explanations is plausible. None has been definitively confirmed. The recordings themselves remain in archives, accessible to researchers but not subjected to the kind of systematic analysis that would resolve the question. The voices in the static, if voices is what they are, represent one of the more concrete pieces of evidence in the larger picture of what the Soviet program may or may not have been doing during the lunar race. They are not proof of anything specific. They are simply a data point that does not match the official narrative as cleanly as one might expect. In a program built on the systematic management of what information reached the public, even small mismatches are worth noting. The far side of the moon, the hemisphere permanently turned away from Earth, represents a unique communication environment for any spacecraft operating in the lunar vicinity. Because the moon itself blocks line-of-sight radio communication between a spacecraft on the far side and any receiver on Earth, all communication from the far side must either be relayed through a separate spacecraft positioned to maintain line of sight, or simply paused until the spacecraft returns to the near side of the moon. During the Apollo missions, this far side communication blackout typically lasted approximately 45 minutes per lunar orbit. During the Soviet Zond and lunar missions that approached or orbited the moon, similar blackout periods occurred whenever the spacecraft passed behind the moon as seen from Earth. What happens in these communication shadows, both for the spacecraft and for any independent observers attempting to listen, is a matter of some interest in the context of Soviet lunar operations. The Apollo missions, despite their public profile, have produced their own set of stories about what astronauts encountered during far-side passes. The most widely circulated of these stories concerns Apollo 10, the second crewed mission to fly to the moon in May 1969. According to declassified transcripts of the mission communications, the Apollo 10 astronauts, Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan, reported hearing what they described as outer space-type music, while they were on the far side of the moon, out of communication with Earth. The relevant transcript section, declassified in 2008 and made publicly available in 2016, includes Cernan and Stafford discussing the sound with apparent surprise, comparing it to the kind of music one might expect in a science fiction film, and expressing some uncertainty about how to report the phenomenon when they regained contact with Earth. The official NASA explanation for the sound offered after the transcripts became public was that it was likely radio interference between the lunar module and the command module, two spacecraft operating in close proximity using radio equipment that could produce unusual interference patterns. This explanation is plausible. It has been the official position of NASA for as long as the question has been publicly discussed. What is less commonly noted is that several other Apollo missions reported similar phenomena, though with less dramatic detail. Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 14, and Apollo 17 all have associated reports of unusual radio phenomena during far-side passes, recorded in technical communications logs rather than in the public mission summaries. The nature of these phenomena varies. Some are described as music-like, some as voice-like, some simply as unusual electromagnetic patterns. The official explanations vary similarly: radio interference, equipment malfunction, environmental noise from solar particles. The explanations are technically sound. None has been definitively confirmed for any specific instance. The Soviet equivalent of this phenomenon, what cosmonauts may or may not have heard during far-side communication blackouts, is less well documented in publicly available sources for the reasons of program secrecy discussed in previous sections. but independent observers who monitored Soviet lunar mission communications have reported anomalous signals during periods that corresponded to far-side passes, signals that did not match the expected patterns of mission telemetry or routine communications. Whether these signals originated from the spacecraft, from equipment malfunctions in the receiving systems, from unrelated sources that happened to share the relevant frequencies, or from something else entirely is not determinable from the available records. The far side itself, beyond its role as a communication shadow, has features that have attracted attention from lunar scientists since the first Luna 3 imagery. The hemispheric asymmetry between near and far sides has not been fully explained. The far side has been mapped in considerable detail by subsequent missions, including the Chinese Chang'e program, which landed the Chang'e 4 lander on the far side in January 2019, and has been found to contain features that are not present on the near side. The Aitken Basin, one of the largest impact basins in the solar system, dominates the southern portion of the far side. The crust is thicker on the far side. The mantle composition appears to differ. The reasons for these differences are still being investigated. What was heard on the dark side, whether by Apollo astronauts or by Soviet cosmonauts who may have been there during programs that were never publicly announced, remains a question whose definitive answer is not currently in the public record. The relevant communications transcripts have been partially released. The relevant private recordings exist in archives. The relevant cosmonauts and astronauts have, for the most part, either described their experiences in restricted ways or remained silent on specific questions. The dark side is dark in this sense, for reasons beyond its physical orientation away from Earth. It is dark in the sense that the historical record of what happened there is partial and unlikely to be completed in the foreseeable future. The specific recording referenced in this video's title is, according to the sources that describe it, a transmission from a Soviet cosmonaut conducted during a mission whose full details remain classified by the Russian Federation as of this writing. The recording is said to have been made during a circumlunar flight or a near-lunar reconnaissance mission conducted during the period 1968 through 1973. The cosmonaut making the transmission described in Russian, observing something on the lunar surface that did not match the expected lunar geological features and that did not appear in any pre-mission imagery or reconnaissance data. The cosmonaut's specific words are described differently by different sources, with no consensus on the exact content. What is consistent across sources is the description of an object or formation on the lunar surface, observed during a specific orbital pass, that the cosmonaut reported with surprise, and that subsequent communications addressed in carefully managed language, designed to limit further discussion. The recording, according to all available accounts, was made during a period when the cosmonaut was in communication with ground control through the standard mission communication channels. It was therefore captured by the routine recording systems that documented all such communications. After the mission, the recording would have been processed through the standard post-mission review procedures, which would have produced multiple copies stored in different archives for different purposes: operational analysis, scientific review, historical documentation, and political review. Each of these archive copies would have been subject to its own access control system. What happened to the recording after these standard procedures is where the accounts diverge from the standard pattern. Within a specific number of weeks after the mission, according to multiple sources, the recording was reviewed by senior program officials and determined to require additional handling beyond the standard classification procedures. The reasons documented in the available records, none of which include the actual recording itself, refer to operational sensitivity and national security considerations, without specifying what about the recording produced these designations. The recording was reportedly removed from the routine archives and placed in a separate restricted archive, accessible only to officials at specific high levels of the program hierarchy. Subsequent to this initial restriction, according to accounts from program participants who claim to have been involved in the relevant processes, the recording was subjected to further handling that involved the systematic destruction of the original recording and all known copies. The destruction was reportedly carried out under specific orders, with documentation of the process retained, but with the destroyed materials themselves not recoverable. The decision to destroy the recording, rather than simply restrict access to it, has not been explained in any documented form. The destruction would have been an unusual procedure even by the standards of Soviet space program information management, which more typically restricted access to sensitive materials rather than destroying them outright. The cosmonaut who made the original transmission, according to the same sources, was given specific instructions about what could and could not be said in subsequent debriefings and communications about the mission. The Cosmonaut reportedly complied with these instructions throughout the remainder of their service in the program and did not discuss the relevant mission elements publicly during their subsequent career. Whether the Cosmonaut is still alive, whether they have spoken to any researcher or interviewer about the specific events of the mission, and what they would say if asked directly are questions whose answers depend on the specific identity of the Cosmonaut and the specific circumstances of their post-program life, none of which is reliably documented in publicly available sources. The status of the recording today is therefore precisely what the title of this video states. It was erased. According to the most coherent account that can be assembled from the available sources, the original recording no longer exists, having been destroyed under specific orders during the Soviet era. Whether any unauthorized copies were made before the destruction, whether by intelligence agencies, by individual program participants, or by independent monitors, is not currently known. Various claims to possess such copies have been made over the years, and several recordings have been circulated in association with these claims, but none has been authenticated as the specific recording in question through any verifiable means. The recordings that have been circulated may be the genuine article, copies of unauthorized recordings made before the destruction. They may be fabrications, they may be authentic recordings of unrelated communications that have been misidentified. Without the original recording for comparison, and the original recording by all accounts is gone, the circulating versions cannot be reliably evaluated. The recording that disappeared remains, in this sense, a story rather than an artifact. A story supported by sources of varying reliability, contradicted by no specific evidence but also confirmed by no specific evidence, and unlikely to be definitively resolved within the foreseeable future. The systematic alteration of historical records by the Soviet state was not an occasional response to specific embarrassing events. It was a continuous administrative function, conducted by entire bureaucratic apparatuses devoted to ensuring that the official record reflected the politically required version of history rather than the literal sequence of events. The practice extended into every domain of Soviet life, from political to scientific to cultural, and it operated with a thoroughness that took outside observers decades to fully appreciate. The space program was not exempt from this practice. It was, in some ways, particularly subject to it, because the space program was both technologically classified and politically symbolic. Every aspect of it carried both operational and propaganda significance, and the management of its public face required corresponding management of its documented history. The most visible technique of historical alteration was the systematic editing of photographs to remove individuals who had fallen from political favor. This practice predated the space program by decades. Its use during the Stalin era is well documented, with multiple before and after photograph pairs showing the gradual disappearance of purged officials from official imagery. The technique continued through the post-Stalin era, applied more selectively but no less effectively. In the space program, the most prominent application was the systematic removal of Valentin Bondarenko, the cosmonaut who died in the 1961 fire, from group photographs of the cosmonaut core. Bondarenko had been part of the original 20 cosmonaut training groups selected in 1960. He appeared in numerous group photographs taken during the early training period. After his death, those photographs were systematically retouched to remove him, and the retouched versions became the official imagery used in publications for decades. Bondarenko's existence was not officially acknowledged until 1986, 25 years after his death. The pattern applied not only to individuals but to events. Mission failures that were not publicly acknowledged simply did not appear in the official chronology. The Soviet Union conducted dozens of launches that ended in failure during the 1960s, and most of these were not publicly announced. They appear today in declassified records, but for the Soviet population during the relevant period, they did not exist. The gap between what was happening and what was acknowledged created a kind of double historical record, the actual record of operations, available only to those with appropriate clearances, and the public record visible to citizens and to international observers. The two records diverged in important ways, and the divergence was managed deliberately by specific personnel whose job was to ensure that the public record served the political objectives of the program's leadership. The handling of cosmonaut deaths followed a specific protocol that varied based on the political needs at the time of the death. Komarov's death in 1967 was acknowledged because it was impossible to hide. The Soyuz 1 mission had been publicly announced, and the failed return was visible to international observers. But the circumstances of the mission, including the known defects in the spacecraft that were nonetheless considered acceptable for launch, were not acknowledged. Komarov was presented as a hero who had died serving his country, which was true, but the additional context that would have made the death politically explainable as a system failure rather than an individual tragedy was suppressed. The actual chronology, the engineers who refused to sign off on the flight, the political pressure to launch in time for May Day celebrations, the predictable failure of the parachute system, emerged only after the fall of the Soviet Union. The handling of program failures that did not involve fatalities was simpler. The N-1 rocket explosions, the failed lunar probes, the unsuccessful Mars missions, the abandoned space station prototypes, all of these were simply not announced. The international space community had partial information about Soviet activities through various intelligence channels, but the full extent of Soviet failures during this period was not understood until decades later. Western estimates of Soviet program capability during the lunar race were based on the publicly observable activities and on incomplete intelligence, and they consistently overestimated Soviet readiness for missions that were, in fact, several years behind their American counterparts. The Soviet Union benefited politically from this overestimation, which contributed to the urgency that drove the American program toward its July 1969 success. What this pattern of historical management means for the question of erased records is that the institutional capacity for such erasure was robust and well developed. The destruction or restriction of a specific recording would have been entirely consistent with established practice. The mechanisms existed, the personnel had been trained, the procedures had been refined over decades of application to similar tasks. If a recording was made and subsequently erased, the act of erasure would have been administratively routine, requiring no extraordinary intervention beyond the standard application of techniques used hundreds of times in less consequential contexts. Among the topics that mainstream lunar science has historically struggled to fully accommodate within its standard theoretical framework, the category known as transient lunar phenomena occupies a particularly interesting position. The term refers to short-lived changes in the appearance of specific regions of the lunar surface, changes in brightness, colour, or apparent surface features that have been observed and recorded by astronomers over a period of more than 4 centuries. The phenomena are typically brief, lasting from a few seconds to a few hours, and they are typically associated with specific lunar locations that produce repeated reports over time. The observations have been made by professional astronomers using research-grade telescopes, by amateur astronomers using consumer-grade equipment, and in some cases by automated monitoring systems designed specifically to detect such events. The scientific status of transient lunar phenomena has shifted over the decades. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, the phenomena were taken seriously by professional astronomers and were investigated as legitimate subjects of inquiry. By the mid-20th century, the dominant view among lunar scientists had shifted towards skepticism, with the phenomena increasingly attributed to atmospheric effects, observer bias, or instrumental artifacts. The launch of the Apollo program and the corresponding investment in detailed lunar surface imaging seemed to confirm that the Moon was a geologically dead world in which transient changes should not be expected. Yet through the entire period of mainstream skepticism, reports of transient phenomena continued to accumulate, contributed by experienced observers who could not easily be dismissed as suffering from atmospheric distortion or wishful thinking. In 1968, NASA published a technical report titled Chronological Catalogue of Reported Lunar Events. The report was a comprehensive compilation of transient lunar phenomena, reports going back to 1540, including detailed descriptions, observer information, instrumental specifications, and locations on the lunar surface where the events were reported. The catalogue contained over 500 individual events, ranging from brief flashes of light to extended changes in surface coloration to apparent obscurations of surface features by what was described in the original reports as cloud-like or mist-like material. The fact that NASA produced and published this catalogue represents a significant institutional acknowledgement that the phenomena were really enough to warrant systematic documentation, even if their causes remained unexplained. The specific lunar locations most frequently associated with transient phenomena reports include the crater Aristarchus, the crater Plato, the Schickard crater, the Maricresium region, and the lunar limb in various locations. Aristarchus in particular has produced an unusually high number of reports relative to its size. The crater is sometimes referred to in older astronomical literature as a hotspot for lunar transient activity. Observations of Aristarchus have included reports of red coloration extending across the crater floor, brief flashes of light from specific points within the crater, apparent obscuration of surface features by what appears to be diffuse material, and gradual brightening and darkening of the crater's albedo over periods of hours. Modern attempts to explain transient lunar phenomena have produced several candidate mechanisms, none of which is fully satisfactory. Outgassing, the release of trapped gases from beneath the lunar surface, has been proposed as one possibility, particularly for the more diffuse and longer duration events. There is some evidence supporting this possibility, including detection of radon gas emissions from specific lunar regions by the Apollo missions and by subsequent orbital measurements. Impact events, meteorite strikes producing brief flashes of light, have been proposed for the very brief flash events, and modern monitoring has confirmed that such impacts do produce visible flashes. Electrostatic effects involving the lunar surface dust and the solar wind have been proposed for some of the brightness variations. None of these mechanisms, individually or in combination, accounts for all of the reported observations, and the residual category of unexplained events remains substantial. What this means for the broader question of unusual observations from the Moon, whether by ground-based astronomers or by spacecraft-based observers, is that the lunar surface, despite its general appearance of geological inactivity, does produce phenomena that current science has not fully explained. The phenomena are documented. They have been observed by reliable witnesses using reliable equipment. They occur at specific locations with specific patterns. They are not products of folklore or anecdotal accounts. They are scientific observations whose explanation remains open. In the context of cosmonaut reports of unusual observations during lunar missions, transient phenomena provide important context. Cosmonauts observing the lunar surface from orbit, with much higher resolution and much less atmospheric interference than ground-based observers, would be in an excellent position to witness phenomena that ground-based observers can only partially characterize. Whether specific cosmonaut observations correspond to instances of transient phenomena or to something else entirely is a question that can be addressed only with access to the relevant observational records. The historical record of lunar observations extends back as far as systematic astronomy itself. The Moon, being the closest celestial body to Earth and the only one whose surface features are clearly visible to the unaided eye, has been observed continuously throughout human history. Specific lunar features have been described in astronomical records from ancient civilizations onward. By the time telescopes became available in the early 17th century, accurate maps of the lunar surface were being produced by Galileo, Hevelius, and other early observers. By the 18th century, lunar cartography had developed into a rigorous scientific discipline, with detailed nomenclature for hundreds of surface features. Within this long observational tradition, reports of unusual phenomena on the lunar surface have appeared with surprising regularity. One of the earliest detailed reports comes from a manuscript by the monk Gervase of Canterbury, describing observations made by 5 monks at Canterbury on the evening of June 18, 1178. The monks reported observing a brief flash of light on the upper horn of the crescent moon, followed by what appeared to be a fiery torch flickering on the lunar limb. The observation has been variously interpreted by modern historians and astronomers as the report of a major impact event, possibly the formation of the Giordano Bruno crater on the lunar far side, although this interpretation has been disputed, or as a misidentification of an atmospheric phenomenon, or as a fabrication or exaggeration by the original chronicler. The original manuscript description is detailed enough to be subjected to modern analysis, but not definitive enough to establish the actual cause with confidence. William Herschel, the 18th century astronomer who discovered Uranus, recorded numerous observations of unusual lunar phenomena during his decades of telescopic observation. Herschel reported observing what he described as bright points of light on the dark side of the moon, the unlit portion of the lunar disk during phases other than full moon. These observations were made in 1783, 1787, and 1790, among other dates. Herschel was an exceptionally careful observer whose other astronomical work was of the highest quality, and his reports on lunar phenomena have been preserved in the records of the Royal Society. The phenomena he reported have never been satisfactorily explained. They may have been impact flashes, transient lunar phenomena, observational errors, or atmospheric effects. The available records are insufficient to determine which. The 19th century produced numerous similar reports from astronomers of significant professional reputation. Patrick Wilson at Glasgow reported observations of unusual lights in 1794. Heinrich Olbers, the astronomer better known for his contributions to the discovery of asteroids, reported lunar phenomena in 1821. Carl Friedrich Gauss, the mathematician and astronomer, recorded observations of unusual brightness variations in specific lunar craters. These observations were typically reported in scientific journals, discussed by professional astronomers, and accumulated as part of the body of evidence that something on the lunar surface was occasionally doing things that mainstream lunar theory did not predict. In 1866, the German astronomer Julius Schmidt reported that the small crater Linnaeus, which had been clearly visible in lunar maps and observations since the time of Hevelius, had apparently disappeared. Schmidt's observations indicated that the crater had been replaced by a bright white spot of approximately the same size, with the crater's previous depression no longer visible. The observation was confirmed by other astronomers and produced extensive scientific debate. Whether the crater had actually been altered through some lunar geological process, or whether the change reflected observational error or a change in lighting conditions, was never definitively resolved. The Linnaeus region remains a subject of occasional observation and continues to display features that some observers consider anomalous. In the 20th century, the systematic monitoring of the lunar surface by professional and amateur astronomers produced an increasing volume of transient phenomena reports. The Lunar International Observers Network, established in 1957, coordinated observations from astronomers worldwide and produced detailed records of reported events. Specific events, such as the apparently confirmed observation of a glowing red region near the crater Aristarchus by astronomer Nikolai Kozyrev in 1958, observed using the spectrograph at the Crimean Astrophysical Observatory, produced scientific publications and follow-up investigations. The Kozyrev observation in particular was significant because it was supported by spectroscopic data showing emission lines consistent with hot gas, providing physical evidence for the reality of the phenomenon beyond visual impression. What this historical record establishes is that observations of unusual phenomena on the lunar surface predate the space age by centuries, were made by observers of unimpeachable credentials, and have continued through the modern era despite extensive ground-based and orbital monitoring. The lunar surface is not as quiet as the standard theoretical picture suggests. Something happens there, intermittently and unpredictably, that produces phenomena visible at the distance of Earth. What exactly is happening, and what the cosmonauts and astronauts who came much closer might have seen, are questions that the historical record raises, but does not answer. The catalogue of professional astronomers who have published observations of phenomena on the lunar surface that did not match the expected lunar behaviour of their respective eras is longer than the standard accounts of lunar science typically acknowledge. Each of these observers was, at the time of their observations, working within the dominant theoretical framework of their period, which generally held that the Moon was geologically inactive and that surface changes should not be expected. Each reported observations that they themselves could not fit comfortably within that framework. Each, for the most part, simply documented what they had seen and left the question of explanation to subsequent investigators. William Henry Pickering, the American astronomer who founded the observatory at Mandeville, Jamaica, and conducted decades of detailed lunar observation, was among the most prominent professional astronomers to maintain throughout his career that the lunar surface displayed visible changes that demanded explanation. Pickering observed the lunar surface systematically from approximately 1880 through the 1920s, and he published numerous papers describing specific features that he interpreted as evidence of ongoing lunar activity. He focused particular attention on the crater Eratosthenes, which he claimed displayed seasonal variations in surface coloration that he interpreted as possible evidence of vegetation. He observed apparent migrations of dark patches across the lunar surface that he attributed to insect-like organisms moving in response to lunar conditions. His more speculative interpretations were not accepted by his contemporaries and have not been accepted by subsequent lunar science. But his careful observations of the changes themselves, independent of his proposed interpretations, were published in respected scientific journals and represent a substantial body of data that has not been fully explained. Patrick Moore, the British astronomer who hosted the BBC television programme The Sky at Night for over 50 years, observed the Moon throughout his long career, and reported transient phenomena on multiple occasions. Moore's lunar observations were conducted using equipment ranging from modest amateur telescopes to research-grade instruments at established observatories. He was a careful observer whose work in cataloguing lunar features contributed substantially to the development of modern lunar maps. His reports of transient phenomena, while not the focus of his published work, were recorded in observation logs and occasionally in his books. He maintained throughout his career that the phenomena were real and that they warranted continued investigation. Nikolai Kozyrev, the Russian astronomer whose 1958 observation of apparently hot gas emission from the Aristarchus crater region was mentioned in the previous section, made multiple subsequent observations of similar phenomena at other lunar locations. His work was conducted at the Crimean Astrophysical Observatory, one of the major Soviet astronomical facilities, and his observations were supported by spectroscopic measurements that provided physical data beyond visual impression. Kozyrev's 1958 observation specifically identified emission lines consistent with hot carbon-containing molecules, which he interpreted as evidence of volcanic activity or fumarole-like outgassing from the lunar interior. The observation was eventually accepted by mainstream lunar science as legitimate evidence of lunar outgassing, and it represents one of the few transient phenomena observations that has produced something approaching scientific consensus regarding its cause. Kozyrev continued to observe and publish on lunar phenomena throughout his career, accumulating a substantial body of work that has been respected by Russian lunar scientists, even when it was treated with skepticism elsewhere. In the years immediately following the Apollo program, several professional astronomers continued to report transient phenomena that did not fit easily within the picture of a geologically dead moon that the Apollo missions had appeared to confirm. Winifred Cameron, a NASA astronomer who compiled the 1978 NASA Technical Catalogue of Lunar Transient Phenomena, was among those who maintained that the phenomena warranted continued serious investigation. Cameron's catalogue included over 1,500 individual events spanning more than 4 centuries, drawn from observation logs, scientific publications, and direct reports from observers. She was clear in the introduction to the catalogue that not all of the reports represented genuine phenomena. Some were almost certainly products of observational error, atmospheric distortion, or instrumental artifact. But she was equally clear that the residual category of well-documented events from credible observers could not be dismissed as a whole. The professional credibility of these observers is significant for evaluating the underlying observations. Astronomers who have built careers on the precise observation of celestial objects do not casually report phenomena that contradict their theoretical expectations. The presence in the observational record of such reports, from observers whose other work is taken as reliable, is itself a data point about the reality of the underlying phenomena. The observers may have been wrong about specific interpretations. The phenomena themselves, however, are not so easily dismissed when they are reported repeatedly, from multiple independent observers at specific locations over extended periods of time. The Moon observed from Earth shows things that science has not fully explained. The Apollo missions to the Moon represent the most thoroughly documented exploration of another world in human history. Every minute of each mission was recorded, transcribed, photographed, or telemetered. The astronauts gave press conferences before launch, communicated with mission control throughout their missions, and underwent extensive debriefings upon return. The technical documentation produced by the program fills warehouses. Yet despite this thoroughness, there have been persistent reports, circulated by various sources, with varying degrees of credibility, that the Apollo astronauts witnessed phenomena during their missions that were not included in the public record, that were classified or restricted for various reasons, or that were discussed only obliquely in subsequent years by astronauts who had been instructed not to discuss them directly. The most widely circulated of these reports concern alleged observations of unidentified objects in the vicinity of the Moon. According to various accounts, Apollo astronauts reported sightings of objects whose nature was unclear, conducted brief private discussions with mission control about these sightings, and were instructed to limit public discussion of the events. The technical communications transcripts that have been declassified do include various references to unusual phenomena, unusual radio reception, unusual optical observations, unusual telemetry readings, but most of these can be reasonably attributed to known technical phenomena rather than to mysterious external objects. The more dramatic accounts which describe direct observations of large structured objects, are typically not supported by the declassified record and appear primarily in secondary sources whose original information cannot be verified. What is supported by various accounts from the astronauts themselves in interviews and memoirs published over the decades since the missions is that the experience of being on the lunar surface and in lunar orbit produced impressions that did not always translate easily into the technical vocabulary of the official mission reports. Astronauts described sensations of being observed, observations of phenomena whose nature they could not categorize, and experiences of the lunar environment that exceeded the framework of expected mission events. These descriptions, when offered, tended to be cautious and acknowledged the possibility that the impressions reflected the unusual conditions of spaceflight rather than external causes. But the descriptions were given by men whose professional careers had trained them to distinguish carefully between reliable observations and impressionistic experiences, and they offered the impressions as a separate category from confirmed observations. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the Moon as part of the Apollo 14 mission in February 1971, became one of the most public advocates among the Apollo astronauts for what he called the reality of extraterrestrial intelligence and the existence of contact between such intelligence and Earth. Mitchell's statements, made over decades following his return, included specific claims about what he believed had occurred during the Apollo program and what had been hidden from public discussion. The accuracy of his specific claims is debated. What is not debated is that Mitchell, a trained scientist and military test pilot with no obvious reason to undermine his own credibility, maintained these views consistently throughout his post-Apollo career and was willing to repeat them in public forums where they damaged his professional reputation rather than enhancing it. The pattern persisted of his statements, regardless of their specific accuracy, suggests that Mitchell believed he had access to information that he considered authoritative and that he wanted to convey to the public. Buzz Aldrin, who became the second human to walk on the Moon during the Apollo 11 mission, was the subject of various accounts suggesting that he had observed something during the lunar mission that he had not been permitted to discuss publicly. The accounts varied in detail, with some claiming that Aldrin and Armstrong had seen unidentified objects on the lunar surface, and others claiming that they had seen them in lunar orbit. Aldrin himself, in various interviews over the years, addressed these accounts in different ways at different times. He acknowledged having seen objects in space during the mission whose nature was not obvious to him at the time. He attributed at least some of these observations to panels of the Saturn V rocket's third stage, which had been jettisoned earlier in the flight and continued to follow a similar trajectory. He did not in general support the more dramatic interpretations that had been attributed to him in secondary sources. The overall pattern of Apollo astronaut testimony regarding unusual observations during the missions is one of cautious, qualified statements that neither support the dramatic accounts nor definitively rule them out. The astronauts who have spoken publicly have generally been clear that the missions were extraordinary experiences that included observations whose interpretation was sometimes unclear, and they have generally been equally clear that the publicly circulated accounts of specific dramatic encounters do not, in most cases, match what they themselves remember of the missions. The full content of what was seen and not reported remains a category whose contents are difficult to assess from outside. The radio frequencies used by the Soviet space program for communications with cosmonauts in flight were not secret in the strict technical sense. The relevant frequency bands were known to international observers, including amateur radio operators, foreign intelligence services, and the various organizations that monitored space communications as part of their professional activities. What was secret was the specific operational use of those frequencies during specific missions. When specific channels were active, what kind of communications were being conducted on them, and how the content of those communications was structured. The combination of openly known frequencies and operationally restricted use created a situation in which any sufficiently sophisticated observer could in principle intercept Soviet mission communications, but might not be able to interpret what they were hearing without additional context that was not publicly available. The primary frequency band used by the Soviet program for crewed mission communications during the lunar race era was in the very high frequency range, with specific channels around 121 MHz, 143 MHz, and 166 MHz being used for various purposes, including voice communications between cosmonauts and ground control, telemetry transmission from the spacecraft, and command transmission to the spacecraft. Additional channels in higher frequency bands, including some in the microwave range, were used for specific functions such as ranging, tracking, and certain types of data transmission. The exact allocation of channels to functions varied across missions and across mission phases, with specific channels being activated and deactivated as needed during the course of each mission. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers, mentioned in an earlier section, monitored these frequencies systematically throughout the period of their operations from the converted Italian bunker. Their equipment included multiple receivers tuned to different relevant frequencies, recording systems that captured all reception, and antenna arrays that could be directed at specific portions of the sky to maximize signal reception from spacecraft in different orbital positions. The brothers maintained detailed logs of their reception activities, cross-referenced their recordings against publicly announced Soviet mission events, and produced an archive that, by the time their operations ended in the mid-1970s, contained thousands of hours of recorded space communications from both Soviet and American missions. The contents of the brothers' archive included routine telemetry signals, recognizable voice communications from announced missions, and a category of recordings that they themselves classified as anomalous. Recordings that did not match the patterns expected based on publicly announced mission activities. Some of these anomalous recordings were brief, lasting only seconds or minutes, and contained partial communications whose content could not be fully reconstructed from the available signal quality. Others were longer and contained more complete communications whose content could be partially translated by Russian-speaking analysts. The Russian translations available for the more substantive recordings have produced text that ranges from clearly routine mission communications to text that some analysts have interpreted as descriptions of unusual events. The specific recording referenced in this video's title, to the extent that any of the recordings in private archives can be identified with that description, would have been captured by independent monitors during the period when the relevant mission was being conducted. If the recording was made during a circumlunar flight, it would have been received during the period when the spacecraft was on the near side of the Moon and in line-of-sight communication with Earth. If it was made during a near-lunar reconnaissance mission, it would have been received during the period when the spacecraft was within the operating range of the relevant frequencies and not blocked by the Moon itself. What is interesting about the technical situation is that even if the original Soviet recording was indeed destroyed, copies of the same communication made by independent monitors during the actual transmission would have survived in private archives. The recordings would have captured the actual radio transmission as it was occurring, would have been outside of the control of the Soviet program, and would have been retained by their owners according to the policies of the relevant private archives rather than according to any decision of the Soviet space program. The existence of such copies has been claimed by various researchers over the years. The authenticity of any specific claimed copy is, however, difficult to establish definitively, both because the original Soviet recording is no longer available for comparison, and because the technical signatures that would allow authentication of a specific intercepted transmission have not been documented in publicly available form. The frequency that the cosmonauts were using on the relevant mission is therefore both technically known and operationally undisclosed. Anyone with appropriate equipment could have been listening. Some independent monitors were almost certainly listening. What they captured, if anything, is in archives that have not been fully catalogued or analysed in the decades since. The record of what was transmitted exists in scattered form outside the control of the agency that erased its own copy. Every spacecraft mission involves periods during which routine communications with ground control are not possible. These communication blackouts arise from several causes, including the geometric position of the spacecraft relative to ground stations, the operational requirements of specific mission phases, and certain physical phenomena that interfere with radio transmission. During the Soviet lunar missions and the comparable American missions, communication blackouts were routine occurrences, planned for in advance and managed according to specific operational protocols. What is interesting about these blackouts, in the context of the question of unusual cosmonaut observations, is that they represent periods during which the standard documentation of mission events, the continuous radio link, was not available, and during which whatever happened aboard the spacecraft was witnessed only by the cosmonauts themselves until communications were restored. The most predictable type of communication blackout occurred when a spacecraft was positioned behind the Moon as seen from Earth. The lunar mass blocked direct radio signals, and unless a relay satellite was specifically positioned to maintain communications during the blackout, no transmissions could pass between the spacecraft and Earth-based receivers. For circumlunar and lunar orbital missions, these blackouts typically lasted approximately 45 minutes per orbital period. During this time, the cosmonauts were entirely on their own. They followed pre-planned mission timelines, conducted whatever activities were scheduled, and managed any unexpected events according to their training. When communications resumed as the spacecraft emerged from behind the moon, they could report on what had happened during the blackout, but the report was retrospective rather than concurrent, and ground control had no independent knowledge of what had occurred during the silent period. A second type of blackout occurred during atmospheric re-entry. The high temperatures generated by friction between the returning spacecraft and the upper atmosphere produced a plasma layer that surrounded the capsule and blocked radio communications for a period of approximately several minutes. This blackout was unavoidable given the physics of the re-entry process and was simply accepted as part of every mission. During the blackout, the cosmonauts experienced the most physically intense portion of the mission, the deceleration from orbital velocity to subsonic speeds while being entirely cut off from ground support. The blackout ended when the spacecraft slowed sufficiently for the plasma layer to dissipate, at which point communications resumed and the standard recovery procedures could be coordinated. A third type of blackout was operational rather than physical. During certain mission phases, specifically during major maneuvers that required precise execution of pre-planned procedures, ground control sometimes deliberately reduced or terminated voice communications to avoid distracting the cosmonauts during critical operations. The cosmonauts had been trained to execute these maneuvers autonomously and did not require concurrent ground control guidance. During these operational blackouts, recording continued from the spacecraft's onboard systems, but the live transmission to ground control was paused. The records of what happened during these periods would have been transmitted later as part of the routine post-maneuver data dumps, processed by mission control and integrated into the mission timeline retrospectively. What fills these silences in the operational record varies by mission and by the specific circumstances of each blackout. Most blackouts produce nothing remarkable. The cosmonauts conduct planned activities, the spacecraft performs as expected, and the resumption of communications proceeds smoothly. But a subset of blackouts, across the history of crewed space programs, both Soviet and American, has been associated with reports of unusual events whose nature could not be fully clarified through the post-blackout debriefing process. The cosmonauts or astronauts described after the fact having observed phenomena during the blackout that they could not satisfactorily explain. The descriptions varied from mission to mission, from vague impressions of unusual visual stimuli to specific reports of identifiable objects or events. The investigations of these reports, when investigations occurred, produced documentation that was sometimes classified, sometimes simply filed without further action, and sometimes, according to various claims, destroyed or restricted in ways that prevented subsequent review. The specific Soviet mission whose blackout period reportedly produced the observation discussed in this video would have been one of the missions that involved a lunar far-side communication blackout. The 45-minute window of silence behind the moon would have provided the operational context in which the cosmonaut could observe whatever was observed without immediate transmission to Earth. The report of the observation would have been made when communications resumed on the near side portion of the orbit. The processing of that report by ground control, the documentation produced, and the eventual disposition of the records would have followed the standard procedures for handling unusual mission events, which, as discussed in earlier sections, included specific provisions for managing observations that fell outside the standard mission expectations. Whatever filled the silence was witnessed by the cosmonaut alone, transmitted afterward into a system whose handling of unusual content was already well established. The Committee for State Security of the Soviet Union, the KGB, maintained an extensive interest in unexplained aerial phenomena throughout its existence. The interest predated the space age, having been inherited from earlier Soviet security organizations, and it continued through the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The relevant KGB activities included the collection of reports from military personnel, civilian observers, and scientific institutions, the investigation of specific incidents that appeared to involve unidentified aerial objects, the coordination of these investigations with related military and intelligence functions, and the maintenance of archives of the resulting documentation. The full extent of these activities was not publicly known during the Soviet era and has been only partially revealed since. In 1991, shortly before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the publication of certain previously classified documents revealed that the KGB had operated a systematic UFO research program for at least 15 years. The program was conducted under various organizational designations and at various times had different levels of priority within the broader KGB intelligence portfolio. The documents that were declassified included summary reports, specific incident investigations, and policy directives that established the operational framework for the program. The documents demonstrated that the Soviet security apparatus took the subject of unexplained aerial phenomena seriously enough to commit significant resources to its investigation, including the development of standardized reporting procedures, the training of designated investigators, and the maintenance of relationships with relevant scientific institutions that could provide technical analysis. The volume of material in the KGB UFO archive, according to the available records of its existence, was substantial. Estimates from researchers who have had access to portions of the archive suggest that the documentation includes thousands of individual incident reports, hundreds of detailed investigation files, and various policy documents and analytical studies. The bulk of this material has not been publicly released. The portions that have been released represent a small fraction of the total, and were apparently selected for release based on criteria that have not been publicly explained. The contents of the released portions are interesting, but do not, as a group, support any single specific interpretation of what the underlying phenomena are. They document the reality of the reporting and investigation activities without resolving the questions that the activities were addressing. One of the most widely known incidents documented in the KGB archive, and one of the few for which substantial documentation has been released, is the Petrozavodsk phenomenon of September 1977. On the morning of September 20th, 1977, observers across a large area of northwestern Russia, including the city of Petrozavodsk in the Republic of Karelia, reported observing an extraordinary aerial phenomenon. The phenomenon was described as a brilliant object that appeared in the sky, expanded into a glowing form resembling a jellyfish, and persisted for over 10 minutes while moving across a substantial portion of the sky. The phenomenon was observed by thousands of witnesses, including military personnel, scientific observers, and the general public. Multiple photographs were taken. The phenomenon's effects on the ground included apparent physical damage to certain structures. Windows were reported to have been broken in patterns suggesting unusual energy distributions, and several buildings showed marks that observers attributed to the event. The KGB investigation of the Petrozavodsk phenomenon produced a substantial file that included witness statements, photographic evidence, meteorological analysis, and various scientific assessments. The eventual official explanation attributed the phenomenon to the launch of the Cosmos 955 satellite from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome, which had occurred at approximately the same time as the observations. According to this explanation, the rocket exhaust expanding into the upper atmosphere produced the visible phenomenon with the specific atmospheric conditions of that morning contributing to the unusual visual presentation. The explanation was widely accepted at the time and has been generally accepted since, although some researchers have noted features of the phenomenon, particularly its duration and its reported effects on ground structures, that do not fit easily within the rocket exhaust framework. The relevance of the KGB UFO archive to the question of lunar phenomena is that it demonstrates the existence within the Soviet security apparatus of an established interest in unexplained aerial phenomena and an established infrastructure for documenting, investigating, and managing the information that resulted. Reports from cosmonauts of unusual observations during space missions would have flowed into this same apparatus. The cosmonauts themselves were members of the Soviet armed forces, subject to the security and reporting requirements that applied to military personnel. Their reports would have been handled by the standard channels for sensitive military observations. The KGB would have received the reports as part of its routine intelligence portfolio. The handling of the reports, whether they were treated as routine technical observations, classified incidents, or something requiring additional restrictions, would have depended on factors that are documented only in the still restricted portions of the relevant archives. The Soviet space program was, throughout its existence, organized as a component of the broader Soviet military structure. The cosmonauts were military officers, the launch facilities were military installations. The design bureaus that produced the spacecraft operated under the supervision of the Ministry of Defense and the Military Industrial Commission. The scientific aspects of the program were genuine and significant, but they were always secondary to the military and strategic objectives that justified the program's existence and funding. The Moon, as a destination for Soviet missions, was approached not only as a scientific target but as a strategic location whose properties and resources might be relevant to broader military considerations. The strategic interest in the Moon arose from several factors. The lunar surface offered a potential high-ground military advantage in scenarios involving large-scale space-based military operations. The Moon's mineral resources, if they proved to be exploitable, could provide strategic materials that might be valuable in various technological applications. The lunar far side, permanently hidden from Earth-based observation, offered potential locations for facilities or installations that could be developed without immediate detection by adversary intelligence services. And the Moon's gravitational well, which would shelter objects in lunar orbit from direct detection by Earth-based sensors, offered potential operational advantages for various types of military deployment. These strategic interests were taken seriously by Soviet military planners during the period of the lunar race. Specific studies were conducted on the feasibility of lunar military installations, on the operational requirements of long-duration lunar missions, and on the technological infrastructure that would be required to establish and maintain a permanent or semi-permanent Soviet presence on the Moon. The studies produced detailed proposals that, while not implemented in their full scope, influenced the broader direction of the Soviet lunar program. The cancellation of the manned lunar landing program in the early 1970s was, in part, a recognition that the strategic value of being second to land on the Moon was substantially less than the strategic value would have been of being first, and that the resources required to complete the program could be better deployed in other strategic directions. But the underlying strategic interest in the Moon did not disappear with the program's cancellation. It simply went into a quieter phase. The investigation of lunar anomalies, phenomena observed on or near the lunar surface that did not match the expected lunar features, became, during this period, a topic of specific interest to Soviet military intelligence. The reasoning was straightforward. If the Moon contained features that were not expected, and if those features might have implications for any future military use of the lunar environment, then understanding the features became a legitimate intelligence priority. The relevant investigations would have been conducted as part of the broader Soviet intelligence portfolio, with the lunar anomalies being treated as one specialized category of unexplained phenomena that warranted attention. The specific Soviet military and intelligence investigations of lunar anomalies are documented partially in declassified records and partially in the testimony of former Soviet officials who have spoken about the subject in the post-Soviet era. The investigations included the systematic analysis of lunar imagery from Soviet and foreign missions, the review of Cosmonaut observations and reports, the collection of relevant scientific data from Soviet and international sources, and the development of analytical frameworks for interpreting the resulting information. The investigations were conducted by personnel with backgrounds in technical intelligence rather than in lunar science specifically, and their analytical approach reflected the priorities of intelligence work, establishing what was known, what was uncertain, and what required additional collection, rather than the priorities of scientific publication. The results of these investigations have not been comprehensively released. Specific reports have been declassified or leaked over the years, including some that describe specific lunar features as warranting further investigation, and others that document the systematic monitoring of American lunar mission activities through technical intelligence methods. The releases have provided a partial picture of what the Soviet investigators were doing and concluded, but the full scope of their work remains unclear. Some former officials have stated that the investigations produced specific conclusions about the existence of features on the Moon that were not natural in origin. These statements have not been confirmed by documentation that meets the standards of independent verification. Other former officials have stated that the investigations produced no conclusions of that kind and that the systematic interest in lunar anomalies eventually faded as the strategic priorities of the Soviet military shifted to other concerns. Both versions of the post-investigation history have been advanced by individuals with at least some claim to direct knowledge of the relevant activities. The historical record is not sufficient to determine which version is more accurate, and it is possible that elements of both are true, that the investigations produced specific findings that were taken seriously by some officials and dismissed by others. Within any large scientific institution, there are categories of question that can be asked productively, and categories of question that cannot. The distinction is not always made explicit, and it varies across institutions and over time, but it has substantial effects on what scientific work actually gets done. In the Soviet scientific establishment during the period of the lunar race, the categories of acceptable and unacceptable lunar science questions were established by a combination of explicit guidance from program leadership, implicit cultural norms within the relevant research communities, and the practical constraints imposed by funding priorities and access to research resources. Scientists who worked on lunar topics learned, often without explicit instruction, which questions could be pursued openly and which could not. The categories of acceptable questions included the standard topics of lunar geology, lunar geophysics, lunar surface composition, and the operational requirements for lunar missions. Soviet scientists made substantial contributions to these areas, published extensively in Soviet and international journals, and collaborated when possible with their counterparts in the Western scientific community. The work was high quality, internationally respected, and consistent with the work being done elsewhere in the world. The Soviet lunar science community produced major figures whose contributions to the global understanding of the Moon remained significant decades after their work was completed. The categories of unacceptable questions were more difficult to define explicitly, but they included anything that touched on the specific operational details of the Soviet manned lunar program, anything that suggested the existence of features on the Moon whose nature was not consistent with the standard scientific picture, and anything that implied the existence of activities or observations that the program leadership had decided not to publicly acknowledge. Scientists who pursued questions in these categories did so at significant professional risk. The consequences for those who crossed the lines were rarely dramatic. Soviet science was not generally characterized by the kind of overt suppression that had marked the Stalin era in earlier decades, but they were substantial in the cumulative sense. Funding could be reduced or eliminated. Access to facilities could be limited. Promotion could be delayed or denied. Publications could be obstructed through the various administrative channels that controlled what could be sent abroad or published domestically. The mechanisms were sufficient to discourage all but the most committed researchers from pursuing the relevant questions. Specific cases of Soviet lunar scientists whose careers were affected by their engagement with questions deemed unacceptable have been documented in various memoirs and historical studies published in the post-Soviet era. One pattern that emerges is the case of researchers who began their careers working on standard lunar topics, gradually developed interests in anomalous observations or features, and then found their professional progress obstructed in ways that they eventually attributed to their pursuit of these topics. The researchers themselves often did not initially understand the mechanism that was constraining their careers. They observed that their grant applications were rejected, that their papers were returned for revision and never republished, that their requests for access to specific data were denied without clear explanation. Only retrospectively, sometimes years later, did the pattern become clear. Another pattern that emerges involves researchers who maintain dual research programs, a public program devoted to acceptable topics that they pursued through normal channels and produced regular publications, and a private interest in anomalous topics that they discussed only with trusted colleagues and pursued through informal investigations that did not generate publishable results. These researchers managed their careers successfully within the constraints of the system, while accumulating private knowledge of topics that they could not professionally engage with. Some of them, in the post-Soviet era, have spoken about the dual nature of their work. Their accounts indicate that a substantial body of informal research on lunar anomalies was conducted by Soviet scientists during the relevant period, but was never integrated into the formal scientific record because of the constraints under which the researchers operated. The effects of this pattern on the historical record are substantial. The published scientific literature on the Soviet lunar program contains only the material that the system permitted to be published. The actual research conducted by Soviet scientists during the period, particularly the informal research on anomalous topics, exists, if it exists, in personal archives, in unpublished manuscripts, and in the memories of researchers who may or may not eventually choose to discuss their work publicly. The reconstruction of what Soviet lunar science actually accomplished, beyond the visible published record, is a project that has barely begun and that will likely never be completed in any comprehensive way. Whatever the Soviet scientists who asked the wrong questions actually concluded, the conclusions are not part of the standard literature on lunar science, and will, for the most part, remain outside that literature for the foreseeable future. Among the photographs returned by the various lunar reconnaissance missions of the 1960s and 1970s, both Soviet and American, there exists a small but persistent category of images that has produced extended discussion in alternative research communities and occasional acknowledgement in mainstream sources. The images show features on the lunar surface that some observers have interpreted as structured or artificial in origin. in contrast to the natural geological features that dominate the lunar imagery as a whole. The interpretations are controversial, the evidence is ambiguous, and the standard explanations involve familiar categories of photographic and observational artifact. But the discussion has not entirely subsided over the decades, and specific images continue to be examined by researchers who find the standard explanations unsatisfying. The category of features in question includes elongated objects that appear to extend above the lunar surface, geometrically regular formations that do not match the patterns expected from natural processes, apparent shadows that imply objects of specific shapes, and surface markings that some observers have interpreted as evidence of construction or modification. Each of these categories has produced specific examples that have been discussed extensively in the relevant literature. The discussions have generally not resulted in agreement about the nature of the features, with the standard scientific position being that the features are natural, and the alternative position being that they warrant further investigation. The original photographs are available in archives, and the disputed features can be examined directly by anyone with the patience to study them. The methodological problem in evaluating such features is significant. Photographs of the lunar surface, particularly those taken from orbit at substantial distances with the cameras available in the 1960s, contain numerous artifacts of various types. Film grain, image scanning artifacts, optical distortions, lighting effects, and various forms of noise can produce features that resemble structured objects but that have no physical reality on the lunar surface. The lunar lighting, with its harsh contrast between brilliantly illuminated surfaces and deep black shadows, creates visual impressions that can be misleading. The lunar terrain, with its complex variety of natural geological features, produces shapes that can sometimes resemble structured forms. Distinguishing among these various possibilities requires careful analysis that takes into account the specific photographic conditions, the known characteristics of the imaging equipment, and the geological context of the relevant lunar regions. The mainstream scientific position is that essentially all of the disputed features can be explained as some combination of these familiar factors. The natural geology of the Moon, combined with the limitations of 1960s-era photographic equipment and the unusual lighting conditions of the lunar surface, can account for the appearance of structured features without requiring any actual artificial structures to be present. This position is defensible on technical grounds. It is also, in some specific cases, contested by careful analysts who have examined the original imagery with modern image processing tools and have produced detailed arguments for why the standard explanations do not adequately account for the observed features. The relevant Soviet and American archives contain extensive imagery from the lunar reconnaissance period, and the disputed features can be examined in their original photographic context. The Lunar Orbiter program, conducted by NASA in the mid-1960s to map potential landing sites for the Apollo missions, produced thousands of high-resolution photographs of the lunar surface. The Apollo missions themselves produced an even larger imagery archive, including images from lunar orbit, from the lunar surface, and from various stages of the missions in between. The Soviet lunar and lunar cod missions produced their own imagery, though in smaller quantities and generally at lower resolution than the American programs. All of this imagery is available for examination, and specific images have been the subject of detailed analysis by various researchers over the decades since the missions concluded. What this material does not provide, despite the extensive discussion it has produced, is a definitive resolution of whether any of the disputed features represent actual artificial structures on the lunar surface. The case for natural explanations is strong but not airtight. The case for artificial explanations is suggestive but not conclusive. The middle ground, that some features warrant further investigation while others can be confidently explained as natural, is occupied by researchers whose work has produced careful analyses without producing consensus. The features remain a topic of low-level but persistent discussion in the broader context of lunar exploration, and they have contributed to the cultural perception that the Moon may contain things that the official scientific narrative does not fully accommodate. Whether this perception is justified by the available evidence, or whether it represents the accumulation of misinterpreted photographic artifacts over decades, is a question that the imagery itself does not clearly answer. The disputed structures, whatever they are, continue to invite the eye and the speculation of those who study them. Among the specific lunar features that have attracted sustained attention in the alternative research literature, several have acquired their own names and have become reference points for the broader discussion of possible structures on the Moon. The names, the shard, the tower, the bridge refer to features visible in specific photographs from specific missions, and each has been the subject of detailed analysis by researchers who have interpreted the features as potentially artificial in origin. The features can be examined in their original photographic context, and the analyses can be evaluated against the photographs themselves and against the standard scientific interpretations of what the features represent. The shard refers to a feature visible in a specific image from the Lunar Orbiter 3 mission, taken in February 1967 over the Mare Tranquillitatis region. The feature appears as an elongated, narrow object extending above the lunar surface, casting a long shadow that suggests significant vertical extent. The original image was scanned from the spacecraft's onboard photographic system using the technology available in 1967, which produced raster patterns and various technical artifacts of the resulting digital files. The specific feature identified as the shard has been interpreted by some researchers as a tower-like structure of substantial height. Estimates have ranged from 1 mile to several miles, while the standard scientific interpretation treats the feature as some combination of image artifact and natural lunar topography photographed under unusual lighting conditions. The technical case for the shard being an image artifact is reasonably strong. The Lunar Orbiter Imaging System was an analog photographic system whose scanning process could produce linear features under specific conditions, and the specific image in question shows multiple linear features that are clearly artifacts of the scanning process, rather than features on the lunar surface. The shard could be one such artifact, distinguished from the others only by the angle at which it appears and the specific shadow effects produced by the imaging process. The technical case for the shard being a genuine surface feature is less strong but not entirely absent. Some analysts have argued that the specific characteristics of the shard, including the geometry of its shadow to Y and its position relative to the surrounding features, are difficult to reconcile with a purely artifact-based explanation. The tower refers to a feature visible in the same image as the shard, or in nearby lunar orbiter 3 frames, that has been similarly identified as a possible vertical structure. The tower is generally described as shorter than the shard but more clearly defined in its geometry, with what appears to be a relatively regular shape that some observers have interpreted as suggesting artificial construction. The tower has been the subject of similar analytical debate, with the same general division between mainstream interpretations attributing the feature to image artifacts, or natural topography and alternative interpretations suggesting that it represents a structured object on the lunar surface. The bridge refers to a feature in the Mare Acrisium region, photographed by Lunar Orbiter 5 in 1967, that some observers identified during the original analysis of the imagery as appearing to span across a smaller crater or depression. The feature was actually first publicly discussed in 1953 by John O'Neill, then science editor of the New York Herald Tribune, who reported observing it through ground-based telescopes and suggesting that it appeared to be a natural arch or possibly an artificial bridge. The 1967 lunar orbiter imagery showed the relevant region in much greater detail and produced extensive discussion of whether the feature was natural or artificial. The eventual mainstream conclusion was that the feature is a natural lunar arch, a not uncommon geological formation produced by various processes, and that the apparent symmetry and structure observed from Earth-based telescopes had been a product of the limited resolution available with such telescopes. The case for each of these features being natural is supported by the broader context of lunar geology and the known properties of 1960s-era imaging systems. The case for any of them being artificial is supported by the specific characteristics of the features themselves, which some analysts have argued are difficult to fully explain through purely natural mechanisms. The debate has not been resolved through definitive scientific analysis. The features remain reference points in the broader discussion of what the Moon may or may not contain. What is interesting about the discussion of these features, beyond the question of their actual nature, is what it reveals about how scientific and quasi-scientific communities engage with ambiguous evidence. The same photographs examined by the different observers with different theoretical frameworks produce different interpretations. The mainstream interpretation is supported by professional expertise and is consistent with the broader theoretical framework of lunar science. The alternative interpretation is supported by careful image analysis conducted by researchers who do not accept the mainstream framework as definitive. Both interpretations have something to say, neither on the available evidence has definitively prevailed. Throughout the period of intense lunar exploration in the 1960s and 1970s, The relationship between the American and Soviet space programs involved a complex mixture of public competition and behind-the-scenes information management. The two programs operated as ostensible adversaries, with each side investing significant resources in efforts to surpass the other's accomplishments. But the two programs also exchanged information through various channels: official scientific exchanges, indirect communications through neutral parties, and occasionally direct cooperation on specific technical matters. The information that was exchanged, and the information that was not, followed patterns that revealed shared assumptions about which topics could be discussed openly and which could not. The pattern of classification across both programs is one of the more interesting features of the historical record. Both programs classified certain categories of information that, on the surface, appear similar despite the different political and operational contexts of the two programs. Both classified detailed technical specifications of their respective spacecraft on the grounds that such information could be useful to the other side's military programs. Both classified the operational procedures of their missions on similar grounds. Both classified certain categories of observations made during missions, with the specific categories varying somewhat between the two programs but with significant overlap in the types of observations that received restricted handling. Among the categories of observation that both programs classified at various times were observations of unusual phenomena that were not readily explainable within the existing scientific framework. The NASA approach to such observations was generally to incorporate them into the standard scientific record, while applying various forms of restricted handling to specific aspects, limiting press discussion, controlling the release of specific photographs, and managing the cosmonauts' and astronauts' public statements on the topics. The Soviet approach was generally more restrictive, with such observations being more likely to be entirely excluded from the public record rather than merely managed within it. But the underlying impulse to handle observations of unexplained phenomena with greater care than observations of routine phenomena appears to have been shared. The specific case of lunar imagery showing features that some observers interpreted as artificial has been handled in similar ways by both programs. Both NASA and the Soviet equivalent have made the original lunar imagery available for examination, with appropriate technical caveats about the limitations of the original photographic equipment. Both have responded to suggestions that specific images contain evidence of artificial structures, with statements emphasizing the standard explanations involving natural geology and imaging artifacts. Both have, however, retained certain specific images or image categories in classified or restricted status, with the rationale for these specific restrictions not always being clear from public sources. The Lunar Orbiter Program imagery mentioned in the previous section was processed by NASA and shared with the international scientific community as part of the standard collaboration patterns of the period. The Apollo mission imagery was similarly processed and distributed. The Soviet lunar mission imagery was processed by Soviet institutions and shared more selectively, with significant portions of the original photographic data not being made widely available outside the Soviet Union. The asymmetry in image distribution reflected the different operational cultures of the two programs, rather than necessarily different patterns of classification. The Americans tended toward broader distribution with selective restrictions, while the Soviets tended toward narrower distribution with comparable restrictions applied through different mechanisms. What is interesting about the parallel patterns is that both programs apparently identified similar categories of imagery as requiring careful handling. The specific photographs that have been examined as showing possible artificial features were generally identified as warranting attention by analysts within both programs, sometimes during the initial mission processing, sometimes during later reviews of the accumulated imagery archives. The reasons for the parallel identification have not been fully documented in publicly available materials. The simplest explanation is that the imagery itself contained features that any careful analyst would notice and would want to investigate further, regardless of which program the analyst was working for. A more elaborate explanation would involve some form of communication between the programs about which images warranted attention, conducted through channels that have not been documented in publicly available sources. The historical record on this point is incomplete. Both NASA and the Russian Space Agency have released substantial materials related to the lunar exploration period, but neither has released the complete archives of relevant imagery analysis and discussion. The materials that have been released are sufficient to demonstrate that both programs engaged in significant internal discussion of certain specific images, and that the discussions sometimes resulted in restrictions on public access to the relevant materials. The materials are not sufficient to determine whether the parallel patterns reflected independent assessments by analysts in each program, communication between the programs, or some combination of both. The question remains open, and the relevant archives may eventually provide additional information that allows it to be addressed more definitively. The proposition that the Moon might be partially or entirely hollow has occupied an unusual position in the history of lunar science. The proposition has been treated as fringe speculation by the mainstream science throughout most of its history, dismissed as inconsistent with basic physical principles and incompatible with the available observational evidence. But the proposition has periodically been raised by individuals of substantial scientific reputation, and specific observational facts have at various times been cited as supporting it, at least partially. The status of the hypothesis is not that of an accepted scientific view, but rather of a recurring theoretical possibility that mainstream science has consistently rejected while never quite eliminating from consideration. The basic version of the hollow moon hypothesis proposes that the Moon's interior contains a substantial cavity, or series of cavities, rather than the solid or partially molten material that the standard model of lunar interior structure describes. The hypothesis has been proposed in various specific forms over the decades. Some versions suggest that the entire Moon is essentially a hollow shell, with relatively thin walls and an enormous interior void. Other versions suggest that there are large but discrete cavities within an otherwise solid lunar interior. Still other versions propose that the apparent hollowness is a consequence of unusual internal density distributions rather than of literal voids. The various forms of the hypothesis differ substantially in their specific predictions and in their consistency with the available evidence. The most prominent historical advocates of variations on the hollow moon hypothesis have included individuals whose scientific credentials make their advocacy worth considering seriously. The Soviet scientists Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Shcherbakov, in a 1970 article published in the popular Soviet science magazine Sputnik, proposed that the Moon was an artificial satellite of Earth, a structured object whose interior contained extensive cavities and whose surface concealed a complex internal architecture. The article was speculative and was not presented as established science, but it was published in a respected popular science venue and was authored by individuals with legitimate scientific credentials. The article triggered substantial discussion in the alternative research community and has continued to be cited in subsequent decades, though it has never been treated as serious science by the mainstream lunar science community. Carl Sagan, in his book Intelligent Life in the Universe, co-authored with Joseph Shklovsky in 1966, included a discussion of the theoretical possibility that some moons in the solar system might be artificial. The discussion was speculative and was framed as an exploration of theoretical possibilities rather than as a serious proposal that any specific moon, including Earth's moon, was actually artificial. But the fact that a scientist of Sagan's stature was willing to discuss the possibility in a serious scientific context contributed to the cultural perception that the hypothesis was not entirely beyond the bounds of legitimate scientific inquiry. Sagan himself, in his subsequent career, did not advocate for the hollow moon hypothesis, and indeed dismissed it on multiple occasions as being inconsistent with the available evidence. But the early discussion remains part of the historical record of the hypothesis. The specific observational evidence that has at various times been cited as supporting some version of the hollow moon hypothesis includes the seismic data from the Apollo missions. When the Apollo missions deployed seismometers on the lunar surface and conducted controlled impacts of sent spacecraft components, the resulting seismic signals showed properties that surprised some researchers. The impacts produced lunar oscillations that continued for substantially longer than would have been expected from comparable impacts on Earth. Some commentators, including some scientists who participated in the Apollo program, described the Moon as having rung like a bell in response to the impacts. The duration of the oscillations was eventually attributed to the lunar interior's lower temperature, lower water content, and absence of viscous damping mechanisms relative to Earth, all of which would extend the duration of seismic oscillations through standard physical mechanisms without requiring any hollow interior. But the original observation, and the dramatic phrase used to describe it, contributed to the perception that the lunar interior might be unusual in ways that warranted further consideration. The contemporary scientific consensus is that the Moon is not hollow in any meaningful sense. The seismic data, combined with the gravitational measurements from various lunar missions, including the recent Yarail mission, provide a reasonably detailed picture of the lunar interior that is inconsistent with substantial internal cavities. The lunar interior structure that emerges from the modern data is one of a relatively cool, mostly solid body with a small core and a complex pattern of density variations that reflects the Moon's geological history. The detailed structure has features that remain not fully explained, but those features do not suggest hollowness in any literal sense. The hypothesis has been dismissed by mainstream science, not because it was never seriously considered, but because the accumulated evidence has consistently failed to support it. The seismic monitoring of the Moon that began with the Apollo missions and continued for several years afterward produced one of the most detailed datasets ever assembled on the internal structure and dynamics of another world. The seismometers deployed at 4 Apollo landing sites, Apollo 12, 14, 15 and 16, operated continuously from their respective deployment dates until 1977, when the program was terminated due to budget constraints. The instruments recorded the seismic activity of the Moon over a period of approximately 8 years, accumulating measurements of moonquakes, meteorite impacts, and various other seismic events. The resulting dataset revealed that the Moon, despite its surface appearance of geological inactivity, has a complex and varied seismic environment that includes phenomena not seen on Earth. The seismic events detected by the Apollo seismometers fell into several categories. Deep moonquakes, occurring at depths of approximately 700 to 1200 kilometers below the lunar surface, were the most common type of event, occurring in patterns related to the Moon's orbital position. These quakes appeared to be triggered by tidal stresses from Earth's gravitational pull, with specific source regions producing repeated events when the lunar tidal stress reached appropriate configurations. The deep moonquakes have been studied extensively and provide information about the lunar interior at depths inaccessible to direct exploration. They are reasonably well understood within the framework of standard lunar interior physics. Shallow moonquakes, occurring at depths of approximately 20 to 30 kilometers below the surface, were less common than the deep moonquakes but generally more energetic. The shallow events produced larger seismic signals and were occasionally strong enough to have been potentially damaging to surface installations if any had been present at the relevant locations. The mechanisms producing the shallow moonquakes are less well understood than those producing the deep events. Some have been attributed to thermally driven stresses in the upper lunar crust, others to the relaxation of stresses left over from the major impact events that shape the lunar surface, and others to processes whose nature remains unclear. The shallow moonquakes occurred sporadically rather than in regular patterns, making their characterization more difficult than the more predictable deep events. Meteorite impacts produce their own category of seismic signals, distinguishable from internal moonquakes by their location at the lunar surface and by specific characteristics of the seismic waveform. Impact events were detected at rates that allowed estimation of the meteorite flux at the lunar surface, providing data that has been used to refine the understanding of the population of small bodies in the inner solar system. The impact data was generally consistent with the expected flux of meteorites in the lunar vicinity, though specific anomalies in the temporal distribution of impacts have been noted in some analyses. The category of seismic events that has produced the most ongoing discussion involves a small subset of recorded signals that did not fit cleanly into any of the standard categories. These events, sometimes referred to in the technical literature as non-impact thermal events or by various other designations, had characteristics that distinguished them from both moonquakes and impacts, but that did not match any other identified seismic source mechanism. The events were relatively rare, only a small fraction of the total seismic activity recorded by the Apollo seismometers, but they were sufficiently numerous to constitute a distinct category warranting separate analysis. The interpretations offered for these events have varied. Some analysts have attributed them to unusual thermal stresses in specific locations. Others have suggested that they represent some form of internal activity within the lunar interior that does not match the standard tectonic processes. The events remain incompletely characterized. The seismic data also confirm the persistence of lunar oscillations following major impacts, including the controlled impacts of spent Apollo lunar module ascent stages that were used as calibration events. The lunar oscillations produced by these impacts continued for substantially longer than would have been expected for comparable impacts on Earth, periods of an hour or more in some cases. The extended oscillation duration was eventually attributed to the lunar interior's specific physical properties, particularly its lower temperature and lower water content compared to Earth's interior, which reduced the viscous damping that normally limits oscillation duration on Earth. This explanation is consistent with the available data and is the accepted scientific interpretation of the observed extended oscillations. What the lunar seismic data revealed, in summary, was a body whose internal dynamics are simpler than Earth's, but not as simple as the pre-Apollo picture suggested. The Moon is geologically more active than the Earth-based observations had implied. Its interior has specific features and dynamics that have required substantial revision of the theoretical picture of how small rocky bodies evolve. The seismic data did not reveal any specific evidence of internal artificial structures or activities of any kind, but it did reveal a more complex interior than had been expected, with sufficient ongoing activity to maintain ongoing scientific interest decades after the original measurements were made. Among the most genuinely anomalous features of the Moon's internal structure, as revealed by orbital gravity measurements, are the localized concentrations of mass beneath specific portions of the lunar surface. These features, known as mascons, short for mass concentrations, were first detected in the early 1960s through analysis of the orbital paths of Soviet and American lunar probes. As the probes orbited the Moon, their trajectories were perturbed by variations in the local gravitational field, with specific locations producing stronger gravitational attraction than would have been expected from the surface geology of those locations. The probes were essentially mapping the distribution of mass beneath the lunar surface by responding to the gravitational consequences of that distribution. The mascons are not subtle features. They produce gravitational anomalies large enough to substantially affect spacecraft orbits and to be measured with high precision by modern gravity mapping missions. The Grail mission, Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory, operated by NASA from 2011 to 2012, produced the most detailed gravitational map of the Moon ever assembled. The map revealed mascons of various sizes located beneath specific lunar surface features, with the largest mascons being associated with the major impact basins on the lunar near side. The mascons beneath the Mare Imbrium, Mare Serenitatis and Mare Crisium basins are particularly prominent, representing substantial concentrations of dense material located at depths of tens of kilometers beneath the surface. The standard scientific explanation for the lunar mascons involves the dynamics of the major impact events that created the Maria basins. When large objects impacted the early Moon, they produced enormous craters that subsequently filled with dense basaltic lava flows from the lunar interior. The resulting basins consist of a layer of dense basalt overlying the more compact rock of the lunar mantle. The combination of the dense surface basalt and the upward flow of denser mantle material into the impact basin produces a concentration of mass that produces the observed gravitational anomaly. This explanation is consistent with the geological evidence of how the Maria basins formed and with the detailed structure of the gravity field revealed by Grail and other missions. But the standard explanation does not fully account for all of the observed mascon properties. Some specific aspects of the gravity field remain not fully explained. The distribution of mascons is not exactly what would be expected from impact dynamics alone. Some impact basins have very strong mascon signatures, while others have much weaker ones, and the variation does not correlate cleanly with the apparent ages or sizes of the basins. The detailed three-dimensional structure of the mass concentrations, as revealed by Grail, shows complexity beyond what the simple impact and basalt fill model predicts. The lunar gravity field, despite being among the most precisely measured gravity fields of any planetary body, contains residual features that the current models have not fully captured. The most unusual gravitational anomaly identified by Grail is associated with the South Pole Aitken Basin, one of the largest impact basins in the solar system, located on the lunar far side and partially extending across the South Polar region. The basin is enormous, approximately 2,500 kilometers in diameter and 12 kilometers deep at its deepest point. The gravity anomaly associated with the basin is correspondingly large, and analyses of its structure have suggested the presence of a substantial mass at considerable depth, possibly several hundred kilometers below the surface, that does not match the expected structure for a typical impact basin. The mass has been variously interpreted as the remnant of the impactor that created the basin, as a localized concentration of dense mantle material that rose to a specific depth and then stopped, or as some other feature whose specific nature remains uncertain. The interpretation of these mass concentrations has, in some alternative research contexts, been advanced as evidence for non-natural origins. The specific argument is that the mass distributions are difficult to explain through purely natural processes, and that artificial concentrations of dense material, for example large engineered structures, could in principle produce the observed gravity field. This interpretation has not been accepted by mainstream lunar science, which maintains that the mass concentrations are products of natural geological processes that are complex but not implausible. The alternative interpretation has been pursued by individual researchers, but has not produced evidence that compels mainstream scientific reconsideration. What is clear from the available data is that the lunar interior contains structures that are more complex and more localized than the standard picture of a homogeneously stratified body would predict. The mass concentrations are real features that affect spacecraft operations and that have been precisely measured. Their specific origin and structure remain incompletely understood. The Moon, beneath its quiet surface, contains things that are not fully explained by the current scientific framework. Whether those things include anything that would be of interest beyond standard geological inquiry is a question that has not been resolved by the data available so far. The psychological effects of space travel on the cosmonauts and astronauts who experienced it are well documented in the formal medical and psychological literature of both the Soviet and American space programs. The effects include a range of phenomena: disorientation, sleep disruption, mood changes, cognitive effects that are typical of any extreme operational environment and that generally resolve over time after return to Earth. The space agencies have studied these effects extensively, developed protocols for managing them, and incorporated the findings into the selection and training of subsequent space travelers. The standard psychological literature on space travel is comprehensive and has been refined over decades of experience. What is less thoroughly documented in the formal literature is a more subtle category of effect that some space travelers have described in interviews and memoirs published outside the official program channels. The effects in this category are not pathological in any clinical sense. They do not produce symptoms that meet the criteria for diagnosed conditions, and they do not typically require psychiatric intervention. But they represent persistent changes in the way that returned space travelers perceive themselves, their relationships with other people, their attitudes toward various aspects of human existence, and their understanding of the broader context of human life on Earth. The changes have been described by space travelers from multiple programs and multiple national origins with sufficient consistency to suggest that they reflect a real phenomenon rather than idiosyncratic individual reactions. The phenomenon has been given various names by different observers. The most widely used term is the overview effect, coined by author Frank White in a 1987 book examining the psychological and philosophical reflections of astronauts and cosmonauts. The overview effect refers to the cognitive shift that many space travelers report having experienced upon seeing Earth from space, the perception of Earth as a small, fragile, unified whole, suspended in the vast emptiness of space set against the background of the cosmos. The experience has been described by space travelers as profoundly affecting their subsequent attitudes toward Earth, toward humanity, and toward the larger questions of human existence and purpose. Many returned space travelers have become advocates for environmental causes, for international cooperation, for various forms of human unity that they describe as having become more compelling to them after their experience in space. The overview effect, as typically described, is a relatively benign phenomenon, a perspective-shifting experience that, while profound, produces changes that are generally regarded as constructive. Returned space travelers who have spoken about the experience have generally framed it in positive terms, describing themselves as having gained insight rather than as having suffered any form of damage. The experience has been the subject of extensive discussion in popular literature, and has contributed to the cultural understanding of what space travel does to the people who undertake it. But some space travelers have described experiences during their missions that go beyond the typical descriptions of the overview effect, experiences that they have characterized as involving direct encounters with phenomena whose nature they could not fully understand, perceptions that did not fit comfortably within the standard framework of mission expectations, and persistent reactions that continued well beyond the typical time frame of post-mission adjustment. These descriptions are less common than the standard overview effect accounts and have been offered less frequently in formal public settings, but they exist in interviews, in memoirs, and in private accounts that have circulated within the relevant communities. The cosmonauts and astronauts who have offered these more unusual descriptions have generally been clear that they are not claiming to have witnessed specific identifiable phenomena that would meet evidentiary standards in any conventional sense. They describe impressions, intuitions, and persistent reactions whose nature is difficult to articulate precisely. They describe feeling at certain points during their missions that something was present that they could not directly perceive, but whose presence affected their experience of the mission. They describe returning from their missions with attitudes toward various large questions. The question of whether humanity is alone in the universe, the question of whether the moon is what it appears to be, the question of whether the broader cosmos contains forms of intelligence beyond our current understanding, that had shifted in directions that did not match their pre-mission positions on these questions. The shifts are described as something they could not entirely account for through specific identifiable experiences during their missions, but as having occurred nonetheless. The space agencies have generally not engaged formally with these more unusual reports, treating them as personal reflections that fall outside the scope of official mission documentation. The reports exist primarily in the post-program lives of the individuals who experience them. Whether they reflect something significant about what space travel actually does to human consciousness, or whether they represent the kind of meaning-making activity that any extraordinary experience produces in the people who undergo it, is a question that the available evidence does not resolve. The post-mission psychological debriefings conducted by the Soviet space program were among the most extensive and most carefully designed elements of the cosmonaut return procedures. Beginning within hours of a cosmonaut's return to Earth and continuing for weeks or months afterward, the debriefings involved multiple specialists, structured protocols, and systematic documentation of the resulting information. The medical aspects of the debriefings were similar to those conducted by the American program: physical examinations, cognitive testing, monitoring of physiological recovery. The psychological aspects were more elaborate and more closely managed, reflecting the Soviet program's institutional priorities regarding the handling of cosmonaut experiences and the information that the cosmonauts brought back from their missions. The standard psychological debriefing protocol involved several distinct categories of session. The initial sessions, conducted in the first days after return, focused on the cosmonaut's immediate psychological state, assessing fatigue, disorientation, mood, and the general capacity to handle the return process. These sessions were essentially medical in character and produced documentation that was reasonably consistent with the corresponding American documentation in terms of the topics covered and the information collected. The intermediate sessions, conducted in the first weeks after return, focused on the cosmonauts' recollections of the mission itself, what they remembered, how they organized their memories of mission events, what they identified as the most significant aspects of the experience. These sessions began the process of extracting from the cosmonaut the specific information about the mission that the program wanted to document. The later sessions, conducted in the weeks to months after return, focused on what the program designated as the integration phase, the process by which the cosmonaut's experience of the mission would be integrated into the cosmonaut's subsequent professional and personal life. These sessions addressed how the cosmonaut would discuss the mission in various contexts, what aspects of the mission could be shared with family and friends, versus what required continued restriction, and how the cosmonaut would manage the long-term psychological consequences of having experienced something that most other people had not experienced. The integration sessions were where the boundaries of acceptable post-mission discussion were established and reinforced. A separate category of session, conducted parallel to the main psychological debriefing track, addressed the specific aspects of the mission that the program had designated as requiring restricted handling. The content of these sessions varied across missions and across cosmonauts, but they typically involved detailed discussion of any observations or events during the mission that did not fit within the standard mission expectations. The specialists conducting these sessions were drawn from a smaller pool of personnel with specific training in handling sensitive information and with appropriate security clearances for the relevant classification categories. The documentation produced by these sessions was handled separately from the standard debriefing documentation and was subject to different access controls. The specific debriefing materials related to cosmonauts who had reported unusual observations during lunar-class missions are documented in inventories of program records that have been partially released since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The inventories list debriefing files by mission designation, cosmonaut identification, and date range. They include indications of the classification levels applied to specific files and the access restrictions that govern their availability for review. The inventories do not include the contents of the files themselves. The contents remain in archives whose access is controlled by procedures that have not been substantially modified since the post-Soviet transition. What is known about the contents of these restricted debriefing files comes primarily from former personnel who participated in the debriefings or who subsequently had administrative access to the resulting documentation. Several such individuals have spoken about the relevant materials in the post-Soviet era, generally in carefully managed ways that respected their continuing obligations under various agreements. The general picture that emerges from these accounts is consistent with the broader pattern discussed throughout this video. The debriefing files contain accounts from cosmonauts of specific observations made during specific missions that were considered, at the time, to warrant restricted handling. The specific observations involved varied across cases. The reasons for restriction varied as well. The common factor was that the observations did not fit within the standard mission expectations and required separate handling to be managed appropriately within the program's information management framework. The eventual disposition of these debriefing files, whether they will be declassified at some future point, whether they will be permanently destroyed, whether they will simply remain in restricted status indefinitely, is not currently determined. Russian archival policy has not generally provided clear timelines for the eventual release of materials that have been classified for extended periods. The materials may remain classified for decades more. They may be quietly destroyed at some point when the relevant institutional authorities decide that they no longer warrant preservation, or they may eventually be released, allowing direct examination of what specific cosmonauts actually reported about their experiences during specific missions. Gennady Strekalov was a Soviet cosmonaut who flew 5 missions over the course of his career, beginning in 1980 and continuing through 1995. His missions included service aboard the Salyut and Mir space stations, and he accumulated over 268 days in space during his career. Strekalov was an engineer by training, having graduated from the Bauman Moscow State Technical University, and he had worked at the Korolev Design Bureau for several years before being selected for cosmonaut training in 1973. By the time of his first mission, he was an experienced engineer with detailed knowledge of the spacecraft systems on which he would fly. He was, in operational terms, exactly the kind of cosmonaut the Soviet program valued: technically competent, professionally disciplined, and reliably capable of executing complex mission tasks. During one of his missions to the Salyut 7 space station in 1984, Strekalov was part of a crew that reportedly observed an extraordinary phenomenon while in Earth orbit. The specific mission was Soyuz T-12, which docked with Salyut 7 in July 1984. The crew consisted of Strekalov, Vladimir Janabekov, and Svetlana Savitskaya, the second woman to fly in space and the first woman to perform a spacewalk. According to reports that emerged in the years after the mission, some from Strekalov himself and others from Russian space program sources, the crew observed during a particular orbital pass what they described as 7 figures that appeared to be human-like in form and that were visible outside the station for a period of approximately 10 minutes before disappearing. The reported observation has been described in various ways in different sources. Some accounts emphasize the apparent human-like form of the figures, describing them as winged or as resembling angels in various artistic traditions. Other accounts emphasize the size of the figures, which were reportedly perceived as enormous, comparable in scale to large transport aircraft rather than to individual humans. Still other accounts focus on the duration of the observation and the way that all 3 crew members reportedly witnessed the same phenomenon, providing mutual corroboration of the experience. The accounts are inconsistent in their details, reflecting either the difficulty of describing an unusual experience or the variations introduced as the accounts have been retold through multiple sources over multiple decades. What is consistent across the accounts is that something was reportedly observed by the Soyuz T-12 crew during their time on Salyut 7, that the crew documented the observation in their mission reports, and that the resulting documentation was treated by the program with the kind of restricted handling that had been applied to similar reports throughout the program's history. The specific contents of the original mission report have not been released. The cosmonauts themselves have spoken about the experience to varying degrees in subsequent decades, with Strekalov in particular addressing the topic in interviews given before his death in 2004. The Strekalov case is interesting for several reasons. First, it involves a cosmonaut whose general professional credibility was unquestioned. Strekalov was not a marginal figure whose accounts could be easily dismissed as products of inexperience or psychological instability. He was a senior engineer cosmonaut whose technical judgment was trusted by the program's leadership. Second, the observation reportedly involved multiple witnesses, 3 cosmonauts who experienced the same phenomenon simultaneously. The reported simultaneous witness statements provide a form of mutual corroboration that is generally absent from single observer accounts. Third, the observation occurred during a relatively well-documented mission whose general parameters and timeline are known from public records, allowing the reported observation to be situated within a specific context of verified mission activities. The standard interpretations offered for the Strekalov observation, when interpretations have been offered, have included several possibilities. The observation may have been a perceptual phenomenon produced by the unusual conditions of long-duration spaceflight, fatigue, the effects of microgravity on visual processing, the unique optical conditions of the orbital environment. The observation may have involved real external phenomena that were misinterpreted by the crew, perhaps a particularly unusual cloud formation viewed from orbit, perhaps space debris that produced unfamiliar optical effects, perhaps some specific configuration of natural phenomena that the crew could not immediately recognize. The observation may have been embellished in the telling, with the original observation being modest and the retold version becoming more dramatic as it passed through multiple sources. Or the observation may have been substantially what it was reported to be, a genuine encounter with something whose nature has not been satisfactorily explained. Strekalov himself, in his own statements about the experience, was generally cautious and did not advocate for any specific interpretation. He described what he and his crew had observed in terms that left the interpretation to those who heard him. He did not claim to know what the observation represented. He maintained until his death that the observation had occurred as he and his crew had reported it, and that the report had been treated by the program in the manner he described. The systematic declassification of Soviet space program documents in the post-1991 era has produced a substantial body of material that was previously unavailable to researchers. The materials have been released through several channels: the Russian State Archive of Scientific and Technical Documentation, the Russian Federal Space Agency, various individual archives associated with specific institutions of the Soviet program, and through unofficial routes involving the leakage of materials by individuals with archival access. The total volume of released material is substantial, although it represents only a fraction of the original Soviet program documentation. The materials that remain classified continue to be substantial, and the criteria governing the eventual release of additional materials are not always transparent. What the release materials actually contain, with respect to the various questions discussed in this video, is informative but not definitive. The materials provide substantial documentation of the manned lunar program, the L1, L3, and Zond programs, including detailed technical specifications, mission planning documents, training records, and post-mission reports from the unmanned missions that were conducted. The materials confirm the existence of the systematic concealment patterns discussed throughout this video, including the management of program failures, the handling of cosmonaut deaths, and the application of various forms of information restriction to specific categories of mission documentation. The materials provide partial but substantial information about the cosmonauts who were trained for lunar missions, their training programs, and their subsequent careers. What the materials do not provide, in most cases, are the specific contents of the most sensitive documents, the detailed debriefing files for missions that involved unusual events, the restricted reports on specific observations that were classified beyond the standard mission documentation, and the records of certain specific recordings and other materials that have been the subject of speculation in the alternative research literature. The materials that have been released often include references to these more sensitive materials, file inventories that list specific documents by designation, summary reports that reference more detailed underlying documentation, administrative records that document the existence and handling of specific files. But the contents of the referenced documents themselves are generally not part of the release materials. The specific case of materials related to alleged cosmonaut observations of unusual phenomena during lunar missions has produced a partial declassified record that is suggestive but not conclusive. Released materials include references to the categories of report that would have documented such observations, references that confirm the existence of administrative procedures for handling unusual mission events, and the categories of documentation that resulted. The substance of any specific report has generally not been included in the released materials. The closest the release materials come to providing direct documentation of unusual observations is in occasional summary references that mention specific incidents without providing detailed descriptions. One specific category of release materials that has produced significant discussion is the records of the Soviet UFO research program conducted by various military and intelligence institutions. As mentioned earlier, the KGB maintained extensive records of unexplained aerial phenomena throughout its existence, and a portion of these records has been released in the post-Soviet era. The released portion includes specific incident reports, investigation summaries, and policy documents. The contents are interesting but do not, in the release portion, include specific reports of cosmonaut observations during space missions. Whether such reports exist in the unreleased portion is not currently known. The most informative released materials regarding the question of cosmonaut reports of unusual observations are those associated with specific named individuals who have spoken publicly about their experiences. The Strekalov case discussed in the previous section is the most prominent example. Released materials include some technical documentation of the relevant mission, although the specific report of the alleged observation is not included in the publicly available materials. Alexei Leonov, who spoke and wrote extensively in his post-Soviet career about his own experiences and about the experiences of his colleagues, produced a substantial body of public testimony that has been correlated with such released materials as exist for the missions he discussed. The correlations generally support Leonov's accounts in their general outlines, while leaving the specific contents of restricted documents unconfirmed. The pattern that emerges from the released documents is one of incomplete information that is consistent with the general framework discussed throughout this video, without providing definitive confirmation of any specific account of the unusual cosmonaut observations. The documents confirm that the institutional infrastructure for managing such observations existed. They confirm that specific procedures were applied to specific types of observations. They confirm that certain materials were handled in ways that produced documentation of their existence, without producing documentation of their contents. What they do not confirm is the specific contents of those materials. The materials remain in archives, accessible to no one in their detailed contents, and likely to remain inaccessible for an extended period. The Luna 24 mission, launched on August 9, 1976, was the final mission of the Soviet lunar program. The mission was a sample return mission to the Marikrysium region of the lunar near side, intended to retrieve samples from a different geological context than the previous Luna 16 and Luna 20 sample return missions had visited. The spacecraft successfully landed on the Moon on August 18th, conducted its sampling operations, and launched its return capsule on August 19th. The return capsule landed in Siberia on August 22nd, carrying approximately 170 grams of lunar soil and rock samples. The mission was scientifically successful. The samples were valuable for subsequent lunar research, and the technology demonstrated by the mission was capable of being applied to additional missions. What did not happen after Luna 24 was the continuation of the lunar program. Despite the demonstrated capability for additional lunar sample returns, despite the relatively modest cost of additional missions compared to the resources required for the originally planned manned lunar program, and despite the substantial residual scientific interest in additional lunar exploration, no further Soviet missions to the Moon were launched. The lunar program was effectively terminated after Luna 24, and the Soviet Union conducted no further lunar surface or orbital missions for the remainder of its existence. The decision to terminate the program has been attributed to various factors in different accounts, none of which provides a fully satisfactory explanation for the timing or completeness of the termination. The standard explanation for the end of the lunar program involves a combination of budget considerations, competing priorities within the Soviet space program, and a political assessment that further lunar exploration was not necessary to maintain Soviet space program prestige. The Soviet space program in the late 1970s was redirecting resources toward the development of long-duration space stations, the Salyut program, and the subsequent Mir program, which were considered to offer greater scientific and operational value than continued lunar exploration. The decision to focus on Earth orbital infrastructure rather than continuing lunar exploration was a reasonable strategic choice within the broader framework of Soviet space policy of the period. But the standard explanation does not fully account for the timing of the termination. The Soviet space program continued to operate at substantial scale throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and the marginal cost of one or two additional lunar missions would have been small relative to the total program budget. The completed lunar program had developed proven hardware that was available for use in additional missions. The scientific community within the Soviet Union had identified specific additional lunar targets, including potential sample return missions to the lunar far side, to the polar regions, and to specific geological features of interest, that would have provided significant scientific return for relatively modest additional investment. None of these proposed missions was approved. The termination was complete and immediate rather than gradual. Various former program participants have offered alternative or supplementary explanations for the termination in the years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Some have suggested that specific findings from the lunar program, or particularly from the later missions that conducted more detailed surface analysis and orbital reconnaissance, had produced results that the program leadership preferred not to pursue further. The specific findings referenced in these accounts have varied. Some accounts focus on geological discoveries that did not match the standard theoretical predictions. Other accounts focus on radiation environment data that produce concerns about the feasibility of additional missions. Still other accounts focus on observational data, including imagery from the various lunar missions, that produced internal discussions about whether the lunar environment contained features whose investigation might require approaches that the program leadership did not wish to authorize. The most provocative versions of these alternative explanations suggest that the lunar program was terminated specifically because of findings related to the categories of phenomena discussed throughout this video: unusual features observed during the missions, unexplained phenomena recorded by the various instruments, results that did not fit comfortably within the standard scientific framework. According to these accounts, the program leadership concluded that further pursuit of lunar exploration would produce additional results in these categories, which would create increasing difficulty for the program's information management procedures. Terminating the program was, in this account, a way of avoiding the accumulation of additional findings that would require restricted handling. The provocative versions of these explanations have not been substantially documented in the released archival materials. They appear primarily in the post-Soviet testimony of former program participants, generally without specific documentary support. The standard explanation that the program was terminated for ordinary budget and priority reasons remains the official position of the Russian Space Agency and is consistent with the available documentation. The alternative explanations remain in the category of unsupported claims that may or may not eventually be substantiated by further archival releases. The lunar program ended when it ended. Why it ended, specifically when and how it did, is a question that the historical record does not yet definitively answer. The reconstruction of the actual history of the Soviet space program has been a project conducted, in the post-Soviet era, by a substantial community of independent researchers operating both inside Russia and internationally. These researchers have worked from various perspectives: historical, technical, journalistic, and in some cases from positions within or adjacent to the Russian space program itself. They have produced books, articles, documentaries, and online resources that have substantially expanded the publicly available understanding of what the Soviet program actually accomplished during the Cold War era. The community is not monolithic in its conclusions, and significant disagreements exist within it about specific events, the credibility of specific sources, and the appropriate interpretation of various pieces of evidence. But the cumulative work of the community has produced a far more detailed picture of the Soviet program than was available during the Cold War period itself. Asif Siddiqui, an Indian-American historian who has produced what are widely regarded as the definitive English-language accounts of the Soviet-manned lunar program, exemplifies the careful archival research approach that has dominated mainstream historical work on the topic. Siddiqui's books, particularly Challenge to Apollo, draw extensively on declassified Soviet documents, Soviet-era technical publications, and interviews with former program participants. His work has established the basic timeline and structure of the Soviet-manned lunar program in a level of detail that was previously unavailable outside of classified sources. Siddiqui's approach is rigorously documentary, focusing on what can be established through verifiable sources and acknowledging the limits of what can be known from the currently available materials. James Oberg, an American space journalist and historian, has produced extensive work on the Soviet program from a different perspective. Oberg's work has focused particularly on the cases where the official Soviet narrative diverged from what could be verified through independent sources, including cosmonaut deaths that were initially concealed, mission failures that were not publicly acknowledged, and specific operational events that were managed in non-standard ways. Oberg's work has been valuable for documenting the systematic patterns of concealment and management that characterize the program and for identifying specific cases where the public record can be definitively shown to have been incomplete. Anatoly Zak, a Russian-American space researcher who operates the website Russian Space Web, has produced detailed technical reconstructions of specific Soviet programs and missions, drawing on a combination of declassified documents, technical publications, and direct contacts within the Russian space community. Zach's work has been particularly valuable for understanding the engineering details of various Soviet space systems, including the specific hardware that would have been used in missions that were planned but never flown. His reconstructions of the manned lunar program have provided detailed pictures of what those missions would have involved at the technical level. A separate strand of the independent research has focused specifically on the categories of phenomena discussed throughout this video: unusual observations, alleged classified incidents, and other elements of the program that fall outside the standard scientific and technical literature. This strand of research has been conducted by individuals operating in various contexts, including independent journalists, alternative researchers, and individuals with claimed access to specific information through their personal or professional contacts. The credibility of work in this strand varies substantially. Some of the work is careful and well documented within the limits of the available evidence. Some is speculative and based on sources whose reliability cannot be established. Distinguishing among the various contributions requires evaluating each work on its individual merits rather than treating the strand as a whole. Among the more substantial contributions in this strand are the works of researchers who have systematically catalogued the specific incidents and reports that have emerged from various sources over the decades. These catalogues compile reports from cosmonaut memoirs, leaked documents, interviews with former program participants, and other sources, organizing the material chronologically and thematically. The catalogues are not, in themselves, evidence for the truth of the specific reports they contain, but they provide useful overviews of what has been claimed and from what sources, allowing subsequent researchers to evaluate specific claims more systematically than would be possible without the cataloguing work. The collective effect of all this independent research has been to produce a body of public knowledge about the Soviet space program that, while still incomplete, far exceeds what was available during the Cold War or in the immediate post-Soviet period. The general framework of what the program accomplished, what it concealed, and how its information management operated is now reasonably well established. The specific details of the most sensitive aspects of the program remain partially obscured, but even these have been illuminated to some degree by the cumulative work of researchers who have spent decades reconstructing what can be reconstructed from the available materials. The timeline of the program, as it actually occurred rather than as it was officially presented, is now substantially clearer than it has ever been before, though it remains incomplete in ways that may never be fully remedied. The Chinese lunar exploration program, conducted by the China National Space Administration, represents the most active program of lunar exploration currently being conducted by any space agency. The program, known formally as the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program and informally as the Chang'e program after the Chinese mythological figure associated with the moon, began with a series of orbital missions in the late 2000s and has progressed through successively more ambitious mission types in the years since. The Chang'e 1 mission, launched in October 2007, was an orbital reconnaissance mission that produced detailed mapping of the lunar surface. Chang'e 2, launched in 2010, conducted higher resolution imagery acquisition and other orbital activities. Chang'e 3, in December 2013, became the first spacecraft to soft land on the moon in nearly 4 decades, deploying the U2 rover to the lunar surface. Subsequent missions have continued the progression toward increasingly capable lunar operations. The Chang'e 4 mission, in January 2019, became the first spacecraft ever to successfully soft land on the lunar far side. The mission deployed a lander and the U-2 rover to the far side floor of the von Karman crater within the South Pole Aitken Basin, one of the most scientifically interesting locations on the moon, given the basin's status as the largest impact feature on the lunar surface and its potential to provide access to deeper lunar materials than are available at typical landing sites. The mission required the deployment of a separate relay satellite, Kikiao, to maintain communications between the farside surface assets and Earth-based receivers, given the lunar farside's permanent radio shadow from Earth. The Chang'e 4 mission has produced scientific results that have been widely published and that have been generally consistent with the expected findings from a careful exploration of a farside site. The results have included detailed analysis of the surface composition at the landing site, observations of the local geological context, and various technological demonstrations of the capabilities required for far-side operations. The published results have been substantial and have advanced lunar science in specific identifiable ways, but the Chinese program has been notably more selective in its release of information than the comparable American program, and this selectivity has produced some discussion in the international space community about what is being released and what is being retained. The pattern has been particularly notable for specific categories of information: high-resolution imagery of certain regions, detailed surface composition data for specific locations, and specific observations from the Yutu-2 rover that have been mentioned in technical communications but not subsequently elaborated in public releases. The pattern is not unusual for a national space program that operates under different transparency norms than the American program, but it has produced specific cases where the international community has not had access to information that comparable American missions would have released routinely. The most widely discussed of these cases involves a series of images from the Yutu-2 rover that in 2021 showed an object on the lunar surface that the Chinese authorities initially described as a mystery hut, before subsequently revising the description to indicate that the object was a rock formation of unusual shape. The original description and the subsequent revision both attracted international attention. The eventual high-resolution images of the object, after Yutu-2 had moved closer to investigate it directly, confirmed that it was a rock formation rather than any structured object. But the episode illustrated the pattern of selective release that has characterized the Chinese program's communications about specific findings. A separate category of information that has been notably absent from the Chinese program's public communications involves any reports of unusual phenomena observed during missions. The Chinese program has not, in its public releases, mentioned any observations comparable to the various reports that have emerged from the American and Soviet/Russian programs over the decades. Whether this absence reflects the actual absence of such observations, or whether it reflects the program's general approach of releasing only specific categories of information through specific channels, is not currently determinable from the available materials. The future trajectory of the Chinese program includes continued robotic exploration through additional Chang'e missions, the development of a long-term lunar research station in cooperation with Russia, and eventually crewed lunar missions in a timeframe that has now been variously estimated by Chinese officials and outside observers. The crewed missions, when they occur, will produce the first crewed lunar exploration in many decades, conducted by a program whose information management practices differ in important ways from those of the American program that conducted the original Apollo missions. What the Chinese cosmonauts, or taikonauts, in the Chinese terminology, will observe during their missions, and what will be released about their observations, will depend on factors that are not currently predictable. The Chinese program has the technical capability to conduct lunar exploration as thorough as any in history. Whether the results of that exploration will be shared with the international community or retained within the Chinese program will be revealed only as the missions actually occur. Throughout the decades of lunar exploration conducted by the various national space agencies, certain questions have remained persistently unanswered in the publicly available record. The questions are not new, and they have been raised by researchers, journalists, and members of the public in various contexts over the years. The questions have, in some cases, been addressed by official agency statements that have provided general responses without engaging with the specific issues raised. In other cases, the questions have simply not been addressed at all. The pattern of non-response is itself informative, given that the agencies in question have generally been responsive on other categories of question and have produced detailed responses on a wide range of topics related to their lunar exploration activities. The first of these questions involves the specific categories of imagery and observation that have been classified or restricted during and after the various lunar missions. Both NASA and the Soviet/Russian space agencies have classified specific materials over the course of their lunar programs, and the rationale for these classifications has not been comprehensively explained in publicly available documents. The general rationales, national security, the protection of operational procedures, the prevention of misuse of technical information, apply to broad categories of material but do not, in themselves, explain why specific images or observations have been classified while comparable materials have been released. The discrepancies in classification across apparently similar material suggests that specific factors influence the handling of specific items, and those specific factors have not been documented in publicly available form. The second of these questions involves the specific procedures used to handle unusual observations made by astronauts and cosmonauts during their missions. The agencies have acknowledged, in various contexts, that procedures existed for handling observations that did not fit within the standard mission documentation. The specific contents of these procedures and the specific cases to which they were applied have not been documented in detail. The procedures have been mentioned in declassified administrative materials, but the substantive content of how they operated and what they produced has not been substantially released. The third question involves the disposition of specific materials that have been mentioned in various sources, but whose current status is unclear. Recordings, photographs, reports, and other documents have been referenced in administrative inventories, in personal memoirs of program participants, and in various other contexts. The current locations of many of these materials are not known to outside researchers. Some have been claimed to be in active archives, some to have been destroyed, some to have been transferred to other institutions, and some simply to be lost. The agencies have not generally provided comprehensive accountings of what specific materials currently exist, where, leaving the disposition of significant portions of the historical record uncertain. The fourth question, more fundamental than the others, involves what the agencies actually concluded about specific phenomena and observations that they investigated internally. The various agencies conducted extensive internal investigations of unusual observations over the decades of their lunar programs. The conclusions of these investigations have, in most cases, not been comprehensively released in publicly available form. Specific incidents have produced internal reports whose conclusions are referenced in administrative materials, but whose substantive content has not been released. The agencies have offered general statements indicating that their investigations did not produce evidence of extraordinary phenomena, but the specific evidence that supports these general statements has not been provided in detail. These questions have been raised in various forms over the years by researchers and journalists pursuing specific lines of inquiry. The responses have varied. NASA has generally provided more substantive engagement than the Russian Space Agency, although NASA's responses have often involved general statements rather than direct engagement with specific issues. The Russian agency has generally provided less substantive engagement, often declining to address specific questions or providing brief statements that do not engage with the substantive issues raised. The Chinese agency has not been substantially engaged on these questions, given its general approach of selective communication about its program. The pattern of non-response is consistent with the general framework discussed throughout this video. The agencies that operated the original lunar exploration programs developed institutional practices for managing information that included substantial provisions for restricting certain categories of material. The practices were applied to specific cases over the decades, producing the current situation in which substantial portions of the historical record are not available for public examination. The questions about what was actually observed, recorded, and concluded by the agencies during their lunar exploration activities remain, in their specific details, unanswered. Whether they will be answered through future archival releases, through changes in classification policies, or through other mechanisms is uncertain. The agencies have not provided timelines for the eventual release of materials currently held in restricted status, and the materials may remain restricted for an extended period, possibly indefinitely. The questions persist, and the answers, where they exist, remain in archives whose contents are accessible to a small number of people with appropriate institutional authorizations. And yet, despite all of this study, the Moon remains in many ways enigmatic. The reasons for the hemispheric asymmetry between near and far sides are not fully understood. The detailed structure of the lunar interior contains features that the standard models do not fully predict. The transient phenomena observed at specific lunar locations over centuries of telescopic observation remain only partially explained. The seismic events that the Apollo seismometers recorded include categories whose source mechanisms are not definitively identified. The mass concentrations beneath specific lunar surface features have explanations that account for some of their properties but not all. The Moon has been thoroughly observed, but it has not been thoroughly understood. Beyond the questions that mainstream lunar science continues to investigate, there are the broader questions discussed throughout this video. Questions about what specific human explorers may have observed during their missions, what specific records may exist in restricted archives, what specific phenomena may have been documented and then erased or restricted. These questions are not necessarily distinct from the questions of mainstream lunar science. They may in fact be the same questions approached from a different angle, questions about what the Moon actually is and what it contains, asked from the perspective of human observers rather than from the perspective of instrumented measurements. The cosmonaut whose recording was reportedly erased, whoever they were, on whatever mission they flew, in whatever year the relevant events occurred, was, by all accounts, looking at the same moon that has been observed by countless other observers throughout human history. The moon that they saw was not different from the moon that anyone else can see by looking up at the night sky. What may have been different was what they observed at a specific moment, from a specific angle, under specific conditions that may not have been reproduced before or since. The lunar surface presents itself differently under different lighting conditions and from different angles of approach. What appears as undifferentiated terrain from one perspective may reveal specific features from another. What seems geologically inert under sustained observation may exhibit transient phenomena during brief windows of activity. If the cosmonaut observed something specific, and if that something was real, in whatever sense observations of unusual phenomena can be considered real, then that something is presumably still up there. Whatever was observed during a specific mission window has not, presumably, gone anywhere in the intervening decades. If it was a transient phenomenon, it may have recurred since, observed perhaps by other missions whose records are similarly restricted. If it was a persistent feature, it should still be visible to observers who happen to be in the right position at the right time to see it. The moon is patient. It has been doing whatever it does for over 4 billion years. The brief window of human attention represented by the era of lunar exploration is a tiny fraction of that history, and there is no particular reason to assume that the human observations during that window have captured everything the moon has to show. The agencies that operated the historical lunar exploration programs have, for various reasons, restricted access to portions of what their explorers observed. The reasons for these restrictions vary across cases and have not been comprehensively explained. The materials that have been restricted may contain definitive answers to specific questions, or they may contain only ambiguous observations that the agencies decided to restrict out of caution. The materials may eventually be released, or they may remain restricted indefinitely. The decisions about their disposition will be made by institutions whose priorities may not include the resolution of the questions that the materials might address. What remains is the moon itself, still visible in the night sky, still subject to ongoing exploration by current and planned missions, still presenting its surface for observation by anyone with the means to observe it. If there are things on the moon that warrant attention, those things will be observed eventually, either by the formal programs of the space agencies or by other observers who happen to be in a position to see them. The story of what was observed in the past and what was done with the resulting records is a story that may or may not be completed in our lifetime. The story of what the moon actually contains is a story whose chapters continue to be written. With each new mission, each new observation, each new approach to the questions that the moon raises but does not on its own answer, what is still up there is waiting to be seen.